When we think of medieval history, our minds often conjure up images of armored knights galloping across muddy fields, nobles feasting under candlelit ceilings, or monks meticulously copying texts by hand. But tonight's journey isn't about castles or crusades. It's about the people who didn't have titles, lands, or gold. It's about the medieval peasants, the backbone of medieval society, who somehow survived winter after winter without the conveniences we take for granted. These were people who braved the unforgiving cold with ingenuity, resilience, and a kind of stubborn hope that deserves to be remembered. And that's exactly where we begin, with a bone-deep cold and a will to live through it. Imagine this. You're in a mud and straw hut no bigger than your living room. The wind whistles through the walls, like it's trying to haunt you personally. Your only source of heat, a fire in the middle of the room that's half smoke, half embers, and 100% your lifeline. You pull a ragged blanket tighter around your shoulders and glance over at your only pair of boots, if you're lucky enough to own any, slowly drying by the fire. Every creak of the wind outside reminds you that the battle against winter isn't over yet. This wasn't a rare, tragic scenario. This was life for tens of millions of people across Europe for centuries. The average peasant home was what historians call a wattle and daub structure. Basically, wooden stakes woven with twigs and smeared with mud. It's like trying to build a house out of granola bars in hope. Insulation was a concept reserved for dreams, not reality. The walls may have kept out the rain on a good day, but they were hopeless against the kind of cold that froze your breath inside your own mouth. But peasants weren't just sitting around waiting to become medieval popsicles. They had strategies. Some were clever, some were desperate, and many were both. One of the most widespread methods of staying warm was communal living. And I don't mean just with family. You'd bring in livestock, cows, goats, even chickens, into your home at night. Not because you were overly fond of your goat, but because your goat produced heat. Body warmth was the most democratic form of heating available. Everyone gave a little. Everyone got a little. The result? A crowded, noisy, slightly smelly, but significantly warmer sleeping environment. Now let's talk about the fire. The hearth wasn't just the center of the home, it was its beating heart. Everything revolved around it. You cooked over it, dried your clothes by it, and told stories around it. And most crucially, you never let it go out. Starting a fire from scratch in winter wasn't just annoying, it could be a death sentence. So every evening the embers would be banked, a technique where ashes were piled over hot coals to keep them smoldering overnight. In the middle of the night, someone would wake up, either from habit or because it was freezing, and stoke the fire again. Think of it like the medieval version of checking your phone in bed. Only instead of scrolling Twitter, you were making sure your family didn't freeze to death. Even the simplest habits were adapted to the cold. Clothes weren't changed often, not out of laziness, but survival. You'd keep layering garments one on top of the other, creating your own version of medieval thermal wear. Laundry was a rare, warm weather luxury. Washing clothes meant soaking them in freezing water, wringing them out with already numb fingers, and then waiting for days for them to dry, assuming they didn't freeze stiff in the process. Better to live with a little grime than risk pneumonia for a clean shirt. And speaking of layers, let's talk about sleeping. Forget beds with memory foam or even basic box springs. The average peasant bed was a pile of straw on the floor. If you were lucky, maybe a wooden frame. Families often slept side by side, children sandwiched between parents, all huddled under the same worn blankets. Proximity was a survival mechanism, not just a family bonding experience. And here's where things get even more creative, sometimes hilariously so. Peasants would sometimes sleep with heated stones wrapped in cloth at their feet, a kind of proto-hot water bottle, or they'd warm bricks near the fire before bedtime. In some cases, they even stuffed straw into their clothing or bedding for insulation. Modern campers might recognize this trick. It's simple, effective, and incredibly itchy. Still, even with all these tactics, the cold could be cruel. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Winter illnesses like quinsy, a kind of extreme tonsillitis, pneumonia, and frostbite were common and often fatal. There were no antibiotics, no space heaters, no urgent care clinics. Your treatment? Grandma's onion tea, and the sincere hope that you didn't die in your sleep. And here's where it becomes hauntingly real. Death was never far from the door in winter. Many communities quietly understood that some wouldn't survive the season. The elderly, the very young, the sick. These people were most at risk, and everyone knew it. It wasn't spoken aloud, but the fear clung to the air, as sharp as frost on a window pane. Yet, somehow, through all of this, medieval peasants endured. Not because they were superhuman or reckless, but because they learned to adapt. They passed down practical knowledge like firebanking and winter layering. They built their lives around the rhythms of the seasons, even when those rhythms turned brutal. Here's a modern comparison. Think of the last time your heat went out during a cold snap. Maybe the power was out for a few hours, and you bundled up under blankets, lit some candles, and huddled together with your family. That's a mild inconvenience for us. For medieval peasants, that was every winter night. But here's the wild part. It wasn't all misery. Around those hearth fires, people shared stories. They passed on legends, sang songs, and even laughed. There was community in the cold. People didn't just survive the winter, they survived it together. And there's something quietly beautiful about that. In this series, we'll walk step by step through the world these peasants lived in, the tools they used, the meals they ate, the fears they faced, and the clever ways they outwitted a climate that often seemed determined to kill them. And it starts right here with this image. A family wrapped in rags, sitting by a flickering fire, one eye on the embers, the other on each other. Because even in the darkest cold, they found ways to stay warm. Let's shift our focus to something you might not give a second thought today. The ground beneath your feet. Specifically, what it was like to walk every single day on medieval roads. Because while we tend to romanticize the cobbled paths of medieval towns as charming and quaint, most medieval people, especially peasants, would have laughed at that idea. Or cried, maybe both. You see, most people in medieval Europe didn't travel far from home. Not because they were homebodies, but because travel was an absolute nightmare. And it started with the roads, or rather, the near-total lack of them. Imagine trying to get from one village to another, only a few miles apart. In summer, you were battling mud that clung to your boots like wet cement. In winter, the mud froze solid, turned slick with ice, and became a new kind of obstacle, the bone breaker. Let's rewind for a second. What actually was a road in the medieval world? Well, unless you lived near a Roman ruin, you likely didn't have access to anything paved. The Romans were genius road builders, laying down stone highways across their empire. Many of these roads survived into the medieval period, but they were few, far between, and mostly inaccessible to peasants. For everyone else, roads were simply worn-down tracks of dirt. No gravel, no signs, no drainage, just grooves etched into the earth by generations of footsteps, hooves, and wooden cartwheels. These tracks varied depending on the local environment. In low-lying areas, they turned into marshy bogs. In hilly regions, they became rutted and rocky. And in forests, oh, the forests, you were often just hoping you were still on a path at all. Trees grew thick, and the underbrush swallowed trails with little concern for your plans. Getting lost was easy. Getting robbed was easier. And let's not forget, walking wasn't just how you got somewhere. It was how you got everything done. Need to bring your grain to the mill? That's a 5-mile trek with a heavy sack on your back. Want to visit a neighboring village's market? That's another 7 miles. And if your lord summoned you for work on the manor's distant fields, well, lace up your straw and leather shoes and prepare for another long walk through muck and brambles. Yes, medieval shoes deserve a special mention here. Peasant footwear was usually made of leather, shaped more like floppy slippers than anything you'd call supportive. There was no right or left foot, just shoe. Padding was minimal, soles were thin, and waterproofing? Mostly wishful thinking. So you weren't walking on mud, you were walking in mud. Every step squelched, every puddle soaked through, and frostbite? An ever-present threat in winter months. Especially when your only pair of shoes had holes the size of walnuts. And there's more. Animals shared these paths with you. Chickens, pigs, dogs, horses, oxen, every creature that walked the land left its own contribution behind. Sanitation was a foreign concept, so it wasn't just mud you were stepping in. Let's just say that being a medieval pedestrian meant never having clean feet. Here's a modern parallel. Imagine walking several miles to work every day through a construction site mixed with a petting zoo while wearing ballet flats that leak. That's what it was like to be a medieval peasant on the move. But still, they walked. They walked to mass, to market, to marriage. They walked in mourning, and they walked in celebration. Roads, no matter how rough, were the arteries of medieval life, and every footstep told a story of resilience. There were some communities, especially in more organized manorial systems, that occasionally tried to improve their roads. Lords might demand that peasants contribute labor to road maintenance as part of their feudal dues. This often meant cutting back brush, filling ruts with stones, or draining flooded sections. But without regular upkeep, these fixes rarely lasted. Nature always won in the end. Still, there were tricks to surviving the trek. People knew which paths flooded and which stayed dry. They understood seasonal patterns. Some roads were only usable in summer, others only navigable when frozen solid in winter. Travelers often timed their departures according to these unwritten rules. You didn't just go somewhere, you planned for it, sometimes days in advance. And when the weather turned really bad, say in the middle of a medieval blizzard, people didn't risk it. They stayed home, which makes sense when you realize that a simple journey to the next village could kill you. Slipping and breaking a leg? That might mean a slow death without proper medical care. Getting lost at night in the woods? You'd be lucky if all you lost was your direction. Wolves and wild dogs still roamed parts of medieval Europe. Bandits were a reality. Even a turned ankle was a serious problem if no one could come get you. Interestingly, religious pilgrimages were one of the few reasons a peasant might willingly travel great distances on foot. People believed that making a journey to a sacred site could save their soul or someone else's. So even if your shoes were falling apart and the roads were hellish, you might still walk hundreds of miles out of sheer devotion. It puts our modern complaints into perspective. A flat tire, a delayed train, a canceled Uber, all mildly annoying, sure, but compared to trudging through frozen swamps in boots made of stitched cowhide, it sounds almost luxurious. Even within the bounds of a single village, foot travel shaped your world. You might only know what existed within a 5-mile radius of your home. Your entire universe, your friendships, your marriage prospects. Your work was determined by how far your feet could take you. Geography wasn't just landscape, it was destiny. So next time you walk to your mailbox or take a stroll around the block, imagine doing it barefoot, through mud, with the occasional chicken squawk and risk of robbery. That's the medieval experience. Rough, raw, and astonishingly routine. Now that your medieval feet are sufficiently blistered, muddy, and possibly frostbitten, it's time to move on to something more comforting, food. Or at least, what passed for food in the medieval period. Because if you're expecting eggs, toast, a hot latte, or a protein smoothie, well, you'd be in for a rude awakening. And no, brunch was not a thing. Let's begin with the first meal of the day, breakfast. The word itself literally means breaking the fast, but in the Middle Ages, this idea was flexible. For peasants, eating early wasn't a matter of enjoying the sunrise with a croissant. It was about keeping your body from collapsing during a day of brutal labor. So what did you eat? Mostly porridge and beer. Sometimes just beer. That's right, beer. It was actually safer than water. Most streams and wells near settlements were contaminated with human and animal waste. The brewing process, boiling the water, killed many of the pathogens. So even children drank it, though it was a low-alcohol variety called small beer. You'd start the day buzzed, but not drunk. Think of it like medieval Gatorade, mildly hydrating and mildly intoxicating. As for porridge, this wasn't the creamy, honey-drizzled variety you might order at a trendy brunch spot today. Medieval porridge was made from whatever grain was available: barley, oats, rye, and it was often boiled with water, and maybe a pinch of salt if you were lucky. It was bland, mushy, and designed to sit like a stone in your stomach, slowly releasing just enough energy to carry you through a morning of plowing, threshing, or hauling firewood. If you were very poor, and most people were, your breakfast might consist of nothing at all. The church often frowned upon morning meals, especially for adults. Eating early was sometimes seen as a sign of gluttony, unless you were sick, elderly, or doing manual labor, which meant peasants could justify it. Nobles? Less so. Speaking of nobles, you might think they had it better, and in many ways they did, but breakfast still wasn't a grand affair. In fact, among the upper classes, it was often skipped entirely. The two main meals of the day were dinner, which was around midday, and supper, a lighter evening meal. Breakfast was a sort of optional snack that only hardworking folks or the ill would indulge in. But let's not give the nobility too much credit. When they did eat breakfast, it might include bread, cheese, and wine. Fancy, right? Except the bread was probably stale and full of bits of grit from the grinding stones. The cheese was hard and salty, and the wine might have gone sour. Plus, there were no forks, just fingers, knives, and communal bowls. Hygiene standards were not what we'd consider adequate. Now, what if you lived in a monastery? The monastic life was strict, but at least it came with some regularity. Monks usually had a light morning meal after the first of many prayer services. This might consist of bread and a watered-down ale, or on special days, some cooked beans or an egg. The rule of Saint Benedict, a foundational guide for Western monasticism, emphasized moderation, simplicity, and fasting. So monks weren't feasting, but they weren't starving either. Still, it was the same ingredients: bread, beer, and maybe some beans, recycled over and over again. Let's circle back to the peasants, because they make up the vast majority of the population and had the hardest start to the day. After a restless night on a straw mattress with fleas and rats, they would rise with the sun, throw on the same coarse woolen tunic they wore every day, and head straight to work. But first, if they had any, came the quick bite: cold porridge from the night before, maybe reheated over a fire. If there was no porridge left, then maybe a chunk of black rye bread and some small beer to wash it down. Black bread wasn't some artisanal sourdough. No, this was coarse, dark, and dense. Often it was baked in communal ovens, and if you had no access to one, You'd bake your loaf under the ashes in your hearth. Bread was the cornerstone of the medieval diet, but it varied wildly by class. The poor got dark, gritty loaves made from rye or barley, while the wealthy got white bread, fine and soft, sifted multiple times to remove the bran. You might wonder about fruit. Sure, apples and berries were around, but they were seasonal and often considered too cool or wet, according to medieval humoral theory. Yes, medicine at the time believed foods had personalities: hot, cold, moist, dry, and you were supposed to balance them with your own bodily humors. So, if you were melancholy, cold and dry, you were advised not to eat cold and wet foods like cucumbers, unless you wanted to fall deeper into your funk, of course. Milk? Rarely consumed fresh. It spoiled fast and was usually reserved for making butter or cheese. Eggs? Expensive and often reserved for feasts or traded for other goods. Vegetables? Yes, but not the kind we'd celebrate on a trendy food blog. Think onions, leeks, cabbage, and turnips, boiled into a sludge called pottage. This might appear at breakfast if there were leftovers from the night before. In short, medieval breakfast was about survival, not indulgence. You ate what was available, you ate fast, and then you went to work. There was no coffee, no sugar, no pancakes. Just the same ingredients, recycled endlessly in different forms. If you had access to a chicken, you might get an egg. If you were lucky enough to live near a stream and had time to forage, you might add some wild herbs to your porridge. But that was the exception, not the rule. And yet, people got by. They built their strength on this humble fare and went on to plow fields, raise children, fight wars, and build cathedrals. It makes you appreciate that overpriced cappuccino a little more, doesn't it? So, you've washed down your cold porridge with a tankard of weak beer. You've trudged through the mud, dressed in scratchy wool, and your day is just beginning. Naturally, you'd want to freshen up, right? Maybe brush your teeth, splash on some deodorant, or jump into a hot shower? Nope. Welcome to the grimy reality of medieval hygiene. You smell. Everyone smells, and no one really thinks it's a problem. Let's begin with oral hygiene, or more accurately, the general absence of it as we know it today. Toothbrushes? Not invented yet. Toothpaste? Definitely not. Medieval people did, however, know that tooth decay was unpleasant and tried to keep it at bay. They might rub their teeth and gums with rough cloth, or chew on twigs, especially from aromatic trees like hazel or willow. Think of it like a very early, very splintery version of a toothbrush. They also used powders made of things like crushed mint, sage, or even ashes to try and freshen their breath. But let's be honest, this was more ritual than effective. And if you think modern dentistry is unpleasant, imagine having a tooth pulled with no anesthetic by the village blacksmith. Yes, that happened. Sometimes the town barber or even a traveling peddler would perform tooth removals. It was brutal, quick, and likely resulted in screaming. Yours. Now let's talk about bathing. Did medieval people bathe? Surprisingly, yes, just not in the way we might think. Public bathhouses were common in medieval towns, particularly during the early and high Middle Ages. Men and women would sometimes even bathe together, though over time the church got more involved and frowned heavily on this kind of co-ed hygiene. Still, bathhouses weren't entirely about cleanliness. They were also centers of social interaction, and sometimes more than that. Let's just say the line between bathhouse and brothel was occasionally blurry. In the countryside, people might wash in streams or rivers, or fill a wooden tub on bath day, usually once a week, maybe Saturday if you were lucky. But heating water took a lot of time and wood, so most folks made do with washing only the important bits: armpits, face, and if they were very ambitious, feet. This partial washing was done with a cloth, a bit of lye soap if they had it, and cold water. Not exactly spa treatment. Soap itself was rudimentary and often homemade. It was typically made by boiling animal fat with ashes to create a rough, caustic bar that could clean, but would also dry out your skin and leave you smelling a bit smoky. There were also herbal soaps, but those were expensive and reserved for the upper classes. As for deodorant, the medieval solution was herbs. People wore small pouches of lavender, rosemary, or mint to try and mask their natural musk. Nobles might even tuck these herbs into their sleeves or belts. Women wore posies near their breasts, not for decoration, strictly olfactory defense. Think of it as the medieval version of a body spray commercial. Smell like you haven't been digging up turnips all day. And this was necessary because everyone smelled. Homes were smoky from fires. Livestock were often indoors during the winter. Chamber pots were emptied out the window. People rarely changed their clothes because they often only owned one set. And undergarments, if they had them, were washed maybe once a week. Now let's visit the toilet situation. If you lived in a castle, you might have access to a garderobe, a stone seat built into the outer wall with a hole that dropped waste down the side of the building. Fancy, right? But castle dwellers still stuffed dried herbs into the garderobe shaft to mask the smell. No plumbing, no flushing, just gravity. In cities and towns, the solution was a cesspit or communal latrine. And in rural areas, you went in the woods, or the ditch, or wherever you could squat discreetly. Toilet paper? Not a thing. Moss, straw, or even smooth stones were used instead. Some wealthier households used rags, which were washed and reused. Sanitation was essentially non-existent. This lack of hygiene led to some predictable consequences. Fleas, lice, and other vermin were a constant problem. You'd share your bedding with bugs and maybe even rats. Lice combs have been found in archaeological digs, so people were at least trying, but mostly they just lived with it. Nitpicking was a literal activity, often done by family members huddled by the fire. Romantic, right? Even nobility weren't immune. Rich folks had bigger homes, but those homes were rarely cleaner. Tapestries, carpets, and furs trapped dirt and odors. Their chamber pots were emptied by servants, but the smell lingered. Perfume helped, but only to a point. And let's not forget the Black Death. When plague swept across Europe in the 14th century, some blamed bad smells, miasmas, for spreading disease. This idea wasn't entirely wrong, since filthy conditions do encourage disease, but their response was to carry sweet-smelling herbs and burn incense. Some even walked around with beak masks filled with spices. None of it worked against Yersinia pestis, but it shows how deeply odor was linked to health. Ironically, the decline of bathing habits actually occurred after the Middle Ages, during the Renaissance and early modern period. As syphilis and other diseases spread through bathhouses, public bathing was increasingly discouraged. People believed water opened the pores to illness, so they stopped washing altogether and masked their scent with perfume. That's why Versailles smelled like flowers and unwashed aristocrats. So the next time you wake up, brush your teeth, step into a warm shower, and apply some antiperspirant. Pause for a moment. You're experiencing a luxury unknown to nearly every medieval human. They would have killed for a stick of deodorant, and maybe a mint. So you've made it through a day of cold porridge, sore muscles, zero privacy, and your skin still tingling from that lye soap bath you took last month. You're more than ready to crawl into bed and drift off to sleep, right? Well, not so fast. That bed? It's not the cozy mattress heaven you know today. In fact, you might find yourself sleeping with the enemy. And we're not speaking metaphorically. Let's start with the structure of the bed. If you were among the poorest in medieval society, which statistically you were, you didn't have a bed at all. You had straw, maybe a pile of it in the corner of a single-room hut. If you were lucky, it was fresh straw, tucked into a coarse linen sack called a pallet. But often, it was old, musty, compacted straw filled with dust and crawling insects. Think of it as a hay bale someone's been sleeping on for months. And probably not just someone. Fleas, lice, mites, and worse, made their homes here, too. Even medieval texts mention bedbugs, a term that goes back centuries. If medieval people were talking about them, you can be sure they were a very real problem. And since laundry was a rare luxury, sheets, if you had any, were seldom cleaned. Body oils, sweat, and food crumbs from any midnight snacks made these sleeping areas literal bug buffets. If you had a family, you probably shared that straw pile. Children, siblings, even grandparents all huddled together under one rough woolen blanket. It was warmer that way, but it also meant if one person brought lice to bed, everyone got lice. Privacy? Not in this century. If you needed a moment alone, good luck finding it. Now, if you were slightly wealthier, a successful tradesman or minor official, you might own an actual wooden bed frame. These frames were simple, often made of oak or elm, and could be moved or disassembled fairly easily. The mattress, such as it was, might be stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool. Feather beds were prized, but also expensive and hard to clean. Without any sort of waterproof cover or modern sanitation, a good feather mattress could become moldy or flea-ridden within months. Upper-class homes and castles did have grander sleeping arrangements. Four-poster beds with heavy drapes were common among the nobility. These weren't just for style. The drapes helped trap body heat in cold stone rooms and offered a semblance of privacy when servants or family were sharing the space. But even here, don't picture pristine white linens and plumped pillows. Feather pillows often stank. Mattresses weren't ventilated, and though sheets were more common, they were rarely washed. Laundering involved boiling water, harsh lye soap, and lots of scrubbing. It was backbreaking and reserved for very special occasions. Now let's talk about vermin. Remember, medieval buildings weren't sealed structures. Homes were drafty, full of cracks and crevices, and often shared with animals. Chickens might roost in the corner. A pig could be sleeping just outside the door, or inside during colder months. Mice and rats came with the territory. They were drawn to food scraps, of course, but they also made cozy homes in straw beds and beneath floorboards. More than one medieval person probably woke up with a rat sniffing their hair or a mouse nesting in their covers. If you're imagining a charming Disney scenario, stop. These were disease-carrying rodents with sharp teeth and no fear of humans. The furniture itself posed other problems. Bedbugs burrowed into the joints of wooden frames. Fleas laid eggs in the seams of bedding. Without disinfectants or vacuum cleaners, there was no real way to combat infestations. Some households burned their bedding entirely every few years, expensive but sometimes necessary. More commonly, bedding was simply aired out. Villagers would drag mattresses outside on sunny days to let them air, in the hopes that bugs would flee. Spoiler alert, they usually didn't. And if you think night was at least quiet and peaceful, think again. Many villages were full of night sounds: dogs barking, roosters crowing at random hours, babies crying, men stumbling home drunk, and town criers walking the streets announcing emergencies, fires, weather alerts, or even royal news. Towns with churches had bells tolling at specific times throughout the night. You might hear a death bell or a prayer bell long before sunrise. If you lived near a river, frogs and insects would serenade you constantly. Let's not forget the cold. Central heating didn't exist. Wealthy homes had fireplaces in bedrooms, but even those couldn't combat the chill of winter nights. For everyone else, it was about layers, woolen nightclothes, heavy blankets, and sometimes sleeping in your day clothes to preserve warmth. Your breath would form puffs in the air. Frost could form inside the room on especially bitter nights. Children didn't get their own rooms. Neither did most adults. Whole families slept together out of necessity. And if you were a servant, you might be sleeping on a bench in the hallway or even directly on the floor. Your pillow? Maybe a folded-up cloak. Your blanket? Whatever spare rags you could scavenge. So the next time you sink into your memory foam mattress, with your freshly washed sheets and fluffy duvet, just know your medieval counterpart is curling up on a straw-filled sack that smells vaguely of goat, covered in a scratchy blanket shared with 3 siblings and several fleas. Sleep tight? All right, you've made it through your bug-ridden medieval bed. Possibly gotten an hour or 2 of rest between rat scratches and the neighbor's snoring baby. Morning comes. You stretch, you groan, and oh no, you really, really need to go. One major problem. There's no toilet. And worse, there's no concept of a bathroom as you know it. Let's be clear, the medieval world had almost no understanding of modern sanitation. Toilets, plumbing, toilet paper, none of these existed for 99.9% of the population. If you had to relieve yourself, your options were rustic, at best. Let's break it down by social class. If you were a peasant, nature was your bathroom. No designated spot, no privacy. You just headed out to the woods, a field, or the edge of the village. Modesty? Not really a priority. You might try to find a bush or large rock, but there were no guaranteed safe spots. You also had to watch your step. Human and animal waste was literally everywhere. In colder months, going outside meant battling freezing temperatures just to squat in the snow. In cities, things were marginally more civilized, but only barely. People used chamber pots, small portable bowls made of clay, wood, or metal. These were stored under the bed or beside it. You do your business, cover it with a bit of straw or ash to reduce the smell, and then, well, here's where it gets gross. In most towns, there were no sewage systems. Some places had cesspits, holes in the ground where waste was dumped, but often, people simply tossed the contents of their chamber pots out the window or door. Streets quickly turned into open sewers. In fact, there were actual rules in some cities about shouting before you dumped your waste. You were supposed to yell something like "Gardez-le," from the French "Regardez l'eau," or "Watch out for the water," as a warning. Did people listen? Sometimes. But if you were walking down a medieval alley at the wrong time, you might literally get hit with a potful of someone else's breakfast aftermath. Imagine trying to get to work or church while dodging airborne urine. In castles and monasteries, you had something a little more advanced, garderobes. These were small stone closets built into the outer walls of buildings. You'd sit on a wooden plank with a hole in it, and your waste would fall straight down a chute, usually into a moat or river. Sounds clever, right? Except that waste didn't always get carried away. Many castle moats turned into putrid, stagnant cesspools of sewage. Garderobes also lacked ventilation, so you were basically sitting in a cold, stone box filled with the stench of centuries-old filth. The name garderobe literally means guarding the robes, because people would hang clothes in these rooms to deter lice. Yes, the idea was that the ammonia in the fumes would kill insects. A practical tip, but horrifying. And these weren't private. If you were a servant, you shared a garderobe. If you were a monk, you lined up for it with everyone else. Rich nobles might have a personal one, but even they weren't pleasant. No flushing, no water, just gravity. And gravity is messy when you're trying to poop from the second floor. As for toilet paper, forget it. That invention was centuries away. In the medieval world, you used what you had. Moss, hay, leaves, straw, old cloth rags, whatever was softish and available. Some monks used smooth stones or pieces of broken pottery called tersorium. Yes, that's right, shards of clay. If that made you wince, you're not alone. Historians wince too. There were no sinks, no soap dispensers, and no hand sanitizer. Hand washing was a hit-or-miss event, done mostly before meals if you were part of polite society. And since waste was everywhere, in the streets, on your shoes, possibly on your hands, it's no wonder diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid flourished. Worse still, there was no understanding of germs. Medieval people didn't know bacteria even existed. Bad smells were thought to cause illness. This is why people walked around with flowers or sweet-smelling herbs tied to their belts. But the idea of invisible pathogens carried in feces? Not even a whisper of a concept. In some towns, public latrines did exist, usually over rivers or streams, but they were few and far between, often poorly maintained and deeply unhygienic. If you had to go, you waited in line, held your nose, and prayed you didn't fall in. Yes, it happened. And no, there was no protocol for rescue. Now imagine being a woman in this scenario. Modesty rules were stricter, but bathroom options were worse. Women often went out in pairs, using cloaks or shawls for some semblance of privacy. But privacy was relative. There was no such thing as a ladies' room. Everyone was in the same boat, regardless of gender, except women often bore more of the discomfort, shame, and danger of finding a place to relieve themselves safely. As for nighttime, chamber pots. Always. If you woke up needing to go, you didn't stumble out to the field. You reached under the bed. Then, in the morning, it was someone's job, usually a servant or child, to empty the pot, rinse it, and return it for the next round. Hope you don't trip on your way to the window with that sloshing bowl. So what's the takeaway? If you're used to soft toilet paper, flushing water, air freshener, and a private, quiet room with a lock on the door, medieval life would wreck you. Not only would you be humiliated daily by your basic biological needs, but you'd also be living in a society where no one even considered this weird. The stench of human waste, the public nature of defecation, and the total lack of sanitation were just facts of life. You wouldn't last a day, and honestly, you wouldn't want to. So you've gotten through a rough night in your lumpy straw bed, made it to the morning without stepping in a full chamber pot, and maybe even managed to relieve yourself without public humiliation. You're probably thinking, well, at least I've got a house of my own. About that. Let's talk about your charming medieval home. You know, the one with one room, no insulation, no windows, and oh yes, livestock literally sleeping in it with you. It's easy to romanticize the past. Thatched roofs, cozy stone cottages, crackling hearths. Instagram might have you believe everyone in the 14th century lived in a quaint little hobbit hole. But for the average medieval peasant, your home was more barn than bungalow. The typical peasant house was what we'd now call a longhouse or hall house, depending on the region. The basic layout: one big room. No divisions, no doors. Just one open space where you, your family, and your animals all slept, ate, and existed together. Cows, goats, sheep, pigs, chickens, they weren't outside in a barn. They were inside with you every night. Why? Because animals were valuable. Livestock was wealth. Losing an animal to thieves, wolves, or bad weather was a major blow. So people kept their animals close, often right there on the other side of the fire pit, or in many cases, just behind a wooden partition, if that. And the animals weren't exactly potty trained. So yes, your home smelled like a combination of smoke, manure, wet hay, unwashed bodies, and raw milk. It was noisy too. Chickens clucking at dawn, pigs snorting, goats bleating, cows farting. Imagine trying to get your toddler to sleep with all that going on. Or imagine being the toddler, learning to walk while dodging goat turds. What about the floor? No hardwood, no carpet, no tile. Most medieval homes had dirt floors, sometimes sealed, with a mixture of clay and straw, occasionally sprinkled with rushes or herbs to soak up messes. And by messes, we mean everything from spilled ale to baby accidents to cow urine. Those rushes people always mention? Not as clean or aromatic as you might think. They weren't changed often. In fact, they were often layered, new rushes thrown on top of old ones. This turned the floor into a soft, decaying mulch that attracted fleas, lice, and rats. And under that rotting mat, dirt, feces, and centuries of filth. And yes, rats again. Because livestock brings food, and food brings rodents. They nested in the rushes, gnawed at stored grain, and nibbled toes while people slept. Cats were often kept to control them, but they could only do so much. There was no chimney, so all the smoke from cooking fires gathered in the rafters and slowly filtered out through the thatch. The good news? The smoke helped preserve meat and deter bugs. The bad news? Everyone had chronic coughs, blackened lungs, and eye irritation. Babies often suffered from respiratory illness. If your eyes were constantly red and watery, congratulations! You were breathing home. Let's talk space. A typical peasant home might be 15 by 25 feet, smaller than a modern one-car garage. And that housed a whole family: parents, grandparents, kids, animals. Privacy? Forget it. Every bodily function, every argument, every prayer shared. There was usually a single door and maybe a tiny window, often just a wooden shutter or a piece of oiled cloth stretched over a frame. No glass. So your house was dim. Even in daylight, it was smoky and murky. At night, pitch black. Candles were expensive, so most peasants relied on the firelight or rushlights, torches made from animal fat and reeds, smoky, smelly, and short-lived. Heating? One central fire pit. No fireplace, no stove, and no real ventilation. So you either froze or choked. In winter, people wore all their clothes at once and huddled together under animal skins. The animals helped warm the room with body heat, but that's a double-edged sword. You got heat, sure, but you also got lice, mites, and the occasional surprise hoof to the ribs. If your home had an upper loft, and that's a big if, it was just for sleeping. Some wealthier peasants might have a second level made of wooden planks above the animals, accessed by ladder. But again, no privacy. Everyone still shared the same stale air, the same noise, the same stink. Bathing? Not in the house. If you wanted to wash, you either did it in a nearby stream or, if you were lucky, hauled buckets of water inside to splash around in a wooden tub. And that water was reused. The whole family took turns. You always wanted to go first. Now let's imagine your house after a few days of rain. Thatched roofs leaked, especially poorly maintained ones. Mud pooled on the floor. Animal waste mixed with water. The fire smoked more. Everything stank worse. This was your life. This was normal. And remember, this was the standard of living for the vast majority of people. Nobles lived better, yes, But even their homes lacked modern plumbing or insulation. Wealthier houses had tapestries, yes, but those were mainly to block drafts. Even stone castles were cold, musty, and filled with fleas. So next time your heater breaks or your apartment has thin walls, remember, at least your roommate isn't a goat named Buttercup who just pooped in the hallway. Let's say you've adjusted to living with your livestock. You've gotten used to the smell, the fleas, the late-night cow noises, and the constant threat of stepping into something warm and squishy on the floor. But now your throat's a little sore. Your joints ache. You're burning up. Congratulations, you're sick. Again. And in the Middle Ages, everyone was sick. Always. Illness wasn't a surprise. It was the status quo. From cradle to grave, most medieval people lived in a state of chronic discomfort, malnutrition, and persistent disease. And unlike today, there wasn't much to be done about it. First, there's the obvious culprit, hygiene. If you've got a dirt floor, animals in the house, no running water, and human waste being tossed into the streets, it's not exactly a sanitary environment. Germ theory wouldn't be developed until the 19th century. In medieval times, sickness was believed to come from miasma, bad air, or as punishment from God. So, if you got ill, the solution wasn't medicine. It was prayer or bloodletting, sometimes both. Let's talk about water, because that's where a lot of sickness started. In many towns and villages, the local river or stream served as everyone's everything. People bathed in it, animals waded in it, laundry was done in it, and waste was dumped in it. Human waste, animal waste, dead animals, blood from butchers, refuse from tanners and dyers. So, yeah, not great drinking water. Boiling water would have helped, but that took time, fuel, and effort. And many people believed cold water was healthier anyway. Even wells weren't safe. Contamination was rampant. So people often drank ale instead. Low-alcohol small beer was brewed specifically for daily drinking. It was safer than water, but also dehydrating, slightly intoxicating, and full of questionable ingredients. Then there's food. Malnutrition was common. Peasants mostly ate a diet of bread, pottage, a kind of thick vegetable stew, onions, leeks, and maybe a bit of salted pork or cheese. Meat was rare and often reserved for feast days. Vegetables were seasonal, and fruit was considered a luxury. A lack of vitamin C led to scurvy. A lack of protein caused stunted growth and weakened immune systems. People were always hungry. Children were chronically underweight. And when food shortages struck, as they often did, things got ugly fast. Starvation didn't just weaken people. It made them vulnerable to plagues. And there were many. We all know about the Black Death, the bubonic plague that killed anywhere from 1/3 to half of Europe's population in the mid-1300s. But there were also smaller outbreaks before and after, along with countless other diseases that tore through communities like wildfire. Let's list a few of the greatest hits: tuberculosis, slow wasting death, known as consumption. People coughed for months, spat blood, and wasted away. Leprosy, a bacterial infection that led to numbness, disfigurement, and isolation in leper colonies. Smallpox, pustules, scarring, and high mortality. Survivors were often permanently disfigured. Ogotism, caused by eating moldy rye infected with a fungus. It led to hallucinations, seizures, gangrene, and death. It was sometimes called St. Anthony's fire. Dysentery, bloody diarrhea, dehydration, and death, especially dangerous to children and the elderly. Typhoid and typhus, spread by lice and contaminated food or water. The sweating sickness, a mysterious illness that could kill you within 24 hours of the first symptom. Nobody knew what caused it. and it came in waves. And then there were childhood diseases: measles, mumps, whooping cough, diphtheria, all rampant and often fatal. Children were lucky to survive infancy. In some places, up to 50% of children died before the age of 5. If you were born healthy, your chances of surviving long enough to become a sick adult were still pretty bleak. And let's not forget mental illness, which was deeply misunderstood and often feared. People with epilepsy, schizophrenia, or severe depression were thought to be possessed by demons. Treatments included exorcism, chaining, or being ostracized entirely. But hey, there were doctors, of a sort. Medieval medicine was a chaotic mix of folk remedies, religious rituals, astrology, and ancient theory. The human body was thought to be governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was thought to result from an imbalance in these fluids. So if you were sick, a doctor, or more likely a local barber surgeon, might bleed you, purge you with laxatives, or recommend leeches. Sometimes they'd apply crushed herbs, burnt feathers, or boiled urine, or tell you to carry a sachet of dried flowers under your nose. None of this helped. Most of it made things worse. Hospitals existed, but they weren't what you're picturing. Most were run by the church and were more like hospices, places for the poor, the old, or the dying. They focused on comfort and spiritual care, not cures. Monks might offer prayers, clean wounds, or give you weak broth. But if you were really ill, you were often just left to die. Oh, and you were rarely alone. Illness often spread within households. If one child got sick, so did the rest. If one parent got the plague, the whole family followed. Entire villages could be wiped out within days. Imagine getting sick in a one-room cottage with animals nearby. No ventilation, no clean water, no medicine, and a crowd of anxious relatives watching you slowly fade. That was the reality of disease in medieval times. In fact, many people expected to die young. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages was around 30 to 40 years, and that average includes the high rate of infant and child mortality. If you made it to 10, you had a decent shot at 40. But 60? You were ancient, a local legend. Even if you avoided major diseases, you weren't safe. A toothache could kill you. An infected cut could become gangrenous. A broken leg could leave you crippled for life or lead to sepsis. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptics, no anesthesia. You toughed it out or you died. Illness was inescapable, inevitable, and normal. People coughed, limped, and bled their way through life, praying not to fall into the next wave of plague or famine. And for most, that prayer went unanswered. Imagine biting into a tough crust of barley bread and feeling a sharp, stabbing pain shoot through your jaw. Your tooth is rotting again, and the dull ache has turned into something deep and relentless. There's no escape. You can't concentrate. You can't eat. You can barely sleep. Welcome to medieval dentistry, where pain is the procedure and anesthesia is a luxury no one's even thought of yet. In the Middle Ages, oral hygiene was barely a concept. Toothbrushes didn't exist, not in the way we know them. If people cleaned their teeth at all, it might involve a rough linen cloth, salt, ash, or herbs like sage and mint. Chewing sticks were sometimes used, but they were more like desperate improvisations than actual tools. And toothpaste? Forget it. The closest you'd get was a homemade powder of crushed pepper, burnt bread, or pumice. The goal wasn't cleaning so much as trying to scrape off the visible grime and odor. Fresh breath was nice, but no one really understood plaque, cavities, or gum disease. Now, this isn't to say everyone had a mouthful of black stumps. Diet mattered. People consumed less sugar than we do today. No soda, candy, or sticky cereal. Their carbohydrates came mostly from whole grains, which meant slower tooth decay. But the grains were often ground with stone mills, which left tiny bits of grit in the flour. That grit wore down enamel over time, leaving teeth vulnerable. Add in poor nutrition, especially vitamin deficiencies, and the occasional bit of livestock dung in your food, and you've got a recipe for chronic dental misery. So what happened when a tooth went bad? First, you ignored it. Maybe chewed on the other side of your mouth for a while. Maybe drank some ale to dull the ache. But eventually, the pain became unbearable. Enter the local tooth drawer. There were no dentists as we think of them. Instead, teeth were often pulled by barber surgeons, traveling quacks, blacksmiths, or anyone with strong hands and a pair of iron pliers. If you were lucky, you found someone with experience. If not, well, you braced yourself against a wall and hoped they got it out on the first try. There were no antibiotics. If the socket became infected, and it often did, you could die from sepsis or develop a jaw abscess that swelled, burst, and sometimes crushed the airway. A simple toothache could kill, and there were no dentures. If you lost your teeth, you learned to gum your food. Some wealthier people experimented with false teeth made from ivory, bone, or even other human teeth, procured often from corpses. But for the average person, that was fantasy. Gum disease was rampant. Teeth loosened and fell out over time. Chronic halitosis, bad breath, was a fact of life. If your mouth stank, people blamed your diet, your health, or sin, but no one really connected it to bacteria or hygiene. And let's talk aesthetics. Today we care a lot about smiles, whitening, straightening, cosmetic veneers. But in the Middle Ages, the goal was just to keep your teeth as long as possible. Even then, by your late 30s or early 40s, you might have fewer than half remaining. Many people were edentulous, toothless, by 50, assuming they lived that long. So, what about dental remedies? There were some folk cures, but they weren't exactly gentle. Chewing garlic to draw out the rot. Packing a cavity with crushed onion, mustard seed, or resin. Applying heated metal near the face to burn away the worms. Yes, toothaches were sometimes believed to be caused by toothworms. Holding herbs like clove or mint in the mouth. Not ineffective, but not a cure either. Rubbing the gums with honey and salt, or even crushed brick. The toothworm theory deserves a quick detour. People genuinely believed that a small worm lived inside your tooth, causing the pain by wiggling and biting. This idea persisted for centuries and led to treatments designed to smoke, poison, or starve the worm out. Burning herbs or sulfur were applied to the area, sometimes causing more pain than the original problem. And if all else failed, some people turned to religion. Prayers to saints like Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of dentistry, were common. She was martyred by having her teeth pulled out with tongs, so sufferers often lit candles in her name or wore charms hoping for divine dental intervention. It's worth noting that many people simply lived with the pain. Chronic dental issues were so common that they became a background hum of life. A toothache didn't necessarily make you special. It just meant you were human. People worked, ate, and even fought with infected gums and shattered molars. Because what else could they do? In some ways, dental pain was a reminder you were still alive, still able to suffer, and with no modern tools to help, suffering was just part of the job. Today we get numbed, drilled, filled, and sent home with antibiotics and ibuprofen. In the Middle Ages, your best-case scenario was a strong drink and a friend who could yank hard enough. Let's be honest, most of us today have more clothes than we know what to do with. Closets bursting with shirts we haven't worn in a year. Drawers full of socks that never match. Jackets for every season and mood. Fast fashion, online shopping, thrift hauls, brand loyalty. It's all part of our modern identity. But in the Middle Ages, you had one outfit, maybe two, and that was it. Not just because fashion was different, but because owning clothing was expensive, labor-intensive, and deeply tied to your social status. Let's break this down. First, clothing in medieval times was primarily about function, not flair. The materials were coarse, often itchy, and rarely colorful unless you were wealthy. For the average peasant, fabric choices were limited: wool in winter, and maybe linen for the warmer months if you were lucky. Silk, velvet, those were as distant as a trip to Mars. Let's be honest, most of us today have more clothes than we know what to do with. Closets bursting with shirts we haven't worn in a year. Drawers full of socks that never match. Jackets for every season and mood. Fast fashion, online shopping, thrift hauls, brand loyalty, it's all part of our modern identity. But in the Middle Ages, you had one outfit, maybe two, and that was it. Not just because fashion was different, but because owning clothing was expensive, labor-intensive, and deeply tied to your social status. Let's break this down. First, clothing in medieval times was primarily about function, not flair. The materials were coarse, often itchy, and rarely colorful unless you were wealthy. For the average peasant, fabric choices were limited: wool in winter, and maybe linen for the warmer months if you were lucky. Silk, velvet, those were as distant as a trip to Mars. Your base layer was usually a linen undershirt if you could afford it. Linen was cooler, softer, and easier to wash than wool. But even that one undershirt might be handed down, patched, and re-sewn again and again. On top of that went a tunic or gown, usually made of thick wool, warm, yes, but scratchy and heavy when wet. Pants for men, or hose and a codpiece for the well-to-do. Simple long dresses for women. Belts were crucial, both functional and symbolic. They held your pouch, tools, knife, maybe a mug. And shoes? If you had them, they were leather, handmade, and often shapeless. Many poor folks went barefoot, especially children. And undergarments? Forget it. The concept of underwear as we know it didn't really exist for most of the Middle Ages. Some men might wear a breechcloth or loose-fitting linen underpants, but for women, underclothes were almost unheard of, aside from maybe a linen shift or chemise. So why only one or two outfits? Because clothing was unbelievably expensive to produce. Imagine every stage of garment production done by hand: shearing sheep for wool, spinning that wool into yarn using a spindle or spinning wheel, weaving it into cloth on a loom, an extremely slow process, dyeing it, if at all, using natural ingredients like onion skins, madder root, or woad. Some of these were expensive and rare. Sewing the garment by hand, using bone or iron needles and coarse thread, fitting it with no standardized sizes. Everything had to be adjusted person by person. Every inch of that tunic you wore was the product of weeks, maybe months of labor. And this wasn't just your labor, but that of your family, your village, or a local craftsperson. Clothing wasn't disposable, it was precious. People mended their clothes obsessively. A tear in the hem? You patched it. A rip in the armpit? You stitched it up. Children wore hand-me-downs until the fabric itself disintegrated. If you outgrew something, it got resized, reshaped, or recut into something smaller. Clothes were heirlooms. They lived full lives. Even among the wealthy, wardrobes weren't sprawling. Nobles and royals had more outfits, sure, but even then, garments were worn repeatedly and taken apart to be remade into newer styles. What you wore said everything about who you were. your rank, your job, your marital status, and even your geography. A peasant in Kent looked different from one in Burgundy, not because they were stylish, but because materials and customs varied by region. Clothing also became a form of legal regulation. Enter the sumptuary laws, rules that dictated who could wear what. You couldn't just wear purple or gold-threaded garments unless you were royalty or nobility. Even something like fur lining in your cloak could get you fined if you weren't in the right class. And bathing? Rare. So guess what that meant for your clothes? That's right, they stank. A person might bathe once a week if they were lucky, but their clothes? Washed even less frequently. Washing wool was hard, time-consuming, and could shrink or ruin the fabric. People relied on layers to absorb sweat and kept the outer garments as clean as possible, meaning the underlayer got grimy fast. In towns, laundresses made a living boiling linens in lye and scrubbing them in streams or wash tubs. But this was a specialized service. Many people simply accepted that clothing aged, dirtied, and wore thin over time. And heaven help you if you lost or damaged your main outfit. If you only owned two, wearing one while the other dried meant any accident, fire, theft, flood, or even illness could leave you exposed, shamed, or even unable to work. Let's not forget weather either. Rain-soaked wool stays wet for hours. Winters could be brutal with only a thin tunic and a hooded cloak. Summer heat in a heavy woolen dress? Miserable. There was no Gore-Tex, no flip-flops, no lightweight cotton. You suffered through it. In this world, clothing was armor, identity, and survival gear, all rolled into one. And the moment you stepped outside, everyone knew exactly who you were based on what you wore. Your single outfit told the world your class, your trade, your gender, and your place in the unbending social hierarchy. So next time you complain about having nothing to wear, remember, your medieval counterpart wore the same thing every day, patched it repeatedly, couldn't afford a new one, and likely slept in it too. If you're the kind of person who needs personal space to think, unwind, or just breathe, welcome to your worst nightmare. Because in the Middle Ages, privacy didn't exist at all. Not for peasants, not for nobles, not even for kings. Today, we take privacy for granted. You might share a house, but you likely have your own room, or at least your own bed. You can shut a door, close a curtain, take a walk, or put on headphones and tune the world out. Medieval people had none of that. Let's start with peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population. A typical peasant family lived in a one-room cottage. Yes, one room for everyone. That's where you ate, slept, cooked, worked, and took shelter from the elements. There was no bedroom, no kitchen, no bathroom. Just four walls and a smoky hearth. You didn't even have a ceiling, just a thatched roof, which might leak in the rain or house a colony of rats. And there were no glass windows, maybe a tiny hole or wooden shutter to let in light. And when night fell, the place went dark unless you lit a tallow candle or fed the fire. Either way, there was zero expectation of privacy. Parents, children, siblings, grandparents, all sharing the same space. Everyone slept together, often in the same bed, especially during winter when body heat mattered. If you were lucky, there might be a thin partition made of cloth or a straw mat separating one sleeping area from another. But let's be real, that's not privacy. That's symbolic privacy. And of course, there were no bathrooms in the modern sense. If you had to go, you did it outside, in a bucket, or in a communal latrine if one existed nearby. Nighttime emergencies, chamber pot, which someone had to dump, Guess who? Washing up? Same deal. You washed yourself from a shared basin with shared water, and usually in the same room where your siblings were eating or your grandfather was sleeping. Bathing was rare anyway, but when it did happen, it wasn't done alone. Public bathhouses were common in towns, and people often bathed together, men and women included, at least until the church started frowning on that sort of thing. Even in towns and cities, privacy was hard to find. Houses were cramped and built practically on top of each other. Streets were narrow, noisy, and filthy. You could hear your neighbor snoring through the wall, or arguing, or praying, or much worse. And let's not forget workplace privacy. Most labor was done in open fields, communal barns, workshops, or guild halls. No cubicles. No "do not disturb" signs. Just your boss, your co-workers, your apprentices, and the occasional livestock milling around while you worked from dawn to dusk. Now, what about the wealthy? Surely a nobleman had privacy. Well, not really. If you were rich, you had more rooms, yes, but you also had more people constantly around you. Servants, pages, guards, cooks, tutors, advisors. Nobles were rarely alone. Their days were structured and highly social. Even kings and queens had very little personal time. Royalty often performed parts of their day in public, not because they wanted to, but because it was expected. Dressing, praying, eating, all might have an audience. Even childbirth could be a public event to prove the legitimacy of the heir. Imagine being in labor with a dozen people watching to ensure everything was above board. Nobles slept in beds that were often shared. A guest might sleep beside you, or your servant might bed down at your feet. Curtains around the bed offered a little seclusion, but they were more for warmth than for privacy. And correspondence? Forget about it. Letters passed through many hands, and most people couldn't read or write anyway. Secrecy was hard to maintain. News spread fast, and secrets leaked like a cracked ale cask. So why didn't people value privacy like we do? Because the concept didn't really exist. Medieval life was built around community, family, village, guild, church. You weren't an individual first. You were part of a group. Your actions reflected on your household, your family name, your master, your patron, or your village. Being alone could even be suspicious. Wandering off? Hiding something? Planning something wicked? Most people lived in such close proximity that solitude wasn't practical or welcome. And even when people did crave time alone, they had to work for it. A monk might find solitude in a monastery, but only after years of obedience and vows. A hermit might live alone in the woods, but they'd be seen as eccentric or even dangerous. The result? A life where you were never really alone. Someone was always watching, listening, judging. Your spouse, your children, your neighbors, your priest. Privacy was for the dead. We've grown used to the idea that privacy is a right, something worth protecting. But for most of human history, it was a luxury few could afford, and fewer still expected. Let's say you've been transported to medieval Europe and you've somehow survived the initial culture shock. You learn to live with the rats, the lack of toilets, and the constant sound of bells or livestock. You're even starting to enjoy barley soup. But then you smile in the mirror if you can find a polished piece of metal reflective enough, and it hits you. Your teeth are in ruins, and so is everyone else's. Dental hygiene in the Middle Ages was a paradox. On the one hand, people didn't consume the same level of sugar we do today. No tandy, soda, or fruit juice on tap. Sugar was a luxury, imported and expensive, and mostly reserved for the wealthy, who, ironically, had worse teeth because of it. But on the other hand, tooth care was extremely basic. Let's start with the average peasant. They ate a diet heavy in coarse bread, root vegetables, and porridges, often full of grit and debris from the grinding stones used to mill flour. That meant your teeth were constantly being worn down like sandpaper over the years. Some skeletons from the time show teeth filed nearly flat by middle age. And brushing? Not really a thing. Some people did chew twigs to clean their teeth, and there are scattered references to cloth being used to wipe them, but there was no toothbrush in the modern sense, no toothpaste either. Some early home remedies included salt, crushed herbs, ash or vinegar rubbed on the gums, but none of that was pleasant or especially effective.
Now imagine decades of this.
No brushing, no flossing. You're chewing on hard crusts every day. You might lose a tooth while biting into stale bread and just keep eating. You'd get used to the pain, just like you get used to hunger or cold, because there's no dentist around the corner. Well, there were barber surgeons, and they did perform dental work. And by dental work, I mean tooth extraction with pliers. Anesthetics. Nope. You sat on a stool, they gripped your molar and yanked. If it didn't come out the first time, they yanked again. That's if you were lucky. Infection could follow, or the root might break off inside your gum. And forget implants or root canals. If a tooth was bad, it was gone. You lived with the gap, or several gaps. And let's not even talk about abscesses, those painful, pus-filled infections in the gum that could cause your jaw to swell grotesquely, or even kill you if the infection reached your brain. There were no antibiotics to help. Now, the breath situation? As you might expect, not great. With rotting teeth, infected gums, and meat occasionally going bad before being eaten, halitosis was common. Combine that with no breath mints, no chewing gum, no mouthwash, and your average medieval conversation probably required standing at arm's length. People likely got used to the smell. When everyone's breath smells like a chamber pot, no one notices. But visiting from the modern era, you'd absolutely notice. And it wouldn't be subtle. For the wealthy, things weren't much better. Sugar, imported from the Middle East or the Mediterranean, was a rare status symbol. Rich folks used it in desserts, preserved fruits, and even in medicinal syrups. But without modern dental care, sugar wrecked their teeth fast. A 14th century noble might have more cavities than a whole village of peasants. Some nobles used tooth powders made from burnt bone, salt, or mint. These were rubbed onto the teeth with cloth. Again, not great. Often they were abrasive and might clean the surface, but they also eroded enamel. A few courtly figures even had their teeth blackened intentionally, especially in some Eastern cultures. But in Europe, it was more common to just live with tooth rot and mask the pain with wine or ale. As for dentures, the first crude versions were being experimented with by the 16th century, after the medieval period. Before that, if you lost your teeth, you might stuff your cheeks with cloth to fill out your face, or just accept your sunken look and whisper through gums.
Here's something wild. Some historical texts describe people using urine as a mouthwash, human or animal, because of its ammonia content. It sounds revolting now, and to be fair, it was revolting then. But people did what they could with what they had. Even Roman sources mention urine as a dental rinse, and the tradition lingered in some places for centuries. And if you're wondering how anyone had healthy teeth back then, some actually did. Skeletal remains of rural laborers sometimes show relatively healthy teeth with little decay. That's because they had no sugar, little meat, lots of rough greens, and a life too hard to afford indulgences. Ironically, the poor might have had better teeth if they didn't wear them down grinding meal or chewing on bones. Still, oral hygiene wasn't a priority. People had bigger concerns: surviving winter, avoiding plague, finding enough to eat. A toothache was an annoyance until it became a killer.
In short, unless you're ready to live without floss, go months with rotting molars, and sit through an impromptu tooth pulling without anesthetic, you wouldn't last long with medieval dentistry.
Imagine you've just made it through a long, sweaty day in medieval Europe.
You've trudged through muddy streets,
Tended to animals, perhaps helped harvest barley, or stood in the smoke of an open hearth all day. Your skin is sticky, your clothes are soiled, and your hair smells like smoke and goat. Naturally, your modern instincts kick in. It's time for a shower. Only, there is no shower, there's no bathroom, there's no faucet. There might not even be soap. Bathing in the Middle Ages was a complicated affair, largely dependent on where and when you lived, how much money you had, and, more than anything else, your access to water. Let's start with the average peasant. A bath, in the modern sense, was a rare event. People might wash their face and hands daily, especially before meals, as a form of etiquette and piety. But a full-body wash? That could be monthly, or seasonal, or just not a thing. You see, drawing a full bath meant hauling water, by hand, from a well, stream, or rain barrel, then heating it over a fire, which itself required firewood, time, and labor. If you had a wooden tub, you were lucky. Most rural peasants didn't. You might just pour water into a basin and sponge yourself off, or go down to the river in summer. But let's say you were rich. Surely the wealthy bathed more? Well, kind of. In medieval Islamic regions and parts of southern Europe, public bathhouses were a big deal. These were modeled after Roman baths and often featured steam rooms, hot water, massages, and even scented oils. Bathing was a social event, part hygiene, part relaxation, part business networking. In medieval Christian Europe, bathhouses also existed, especially in cities. These stews, from the Old English stead, meaning place, were fairly popular in the early Middle Ages. Men and women might bathe together, which made the church very uncomfortable. And yes, some bathhouses doubled as brothels, which didn't help their image. By the late Middle Ages, public baths were in decline in many regions. Why? Partly due to fears about disease, especially after the Black Death. The idea of bathing opening up the pores and letting in bad air gained traction. Ironically, this meant that during times of greatest filth, people bathed less. And then there was soap. Did it exist? Yes, but it wasn't in every home. The earliest soaps were made from animal fat and wood ash, which created a crude, grayish lye soap. It was harsh on the skin and stripped oils aggressively. It smelled faintly of bacon and smoke. Over time, artisans improved the recipe by adding herbs like lavender or rosemary, and better quality soaps became available in cities like Aleppo, Marseille, and Castile. But soap was expensive. A rural family might have 1 bar a year. It was used primarily for laundry, not for the body. If you did wash your body with it, you likely ended up dry and itchy, especially in winter. Some people used alternatives: sand, flour, or just cold water and scrubbing. In Norse cultures, people used fine ashes mixed with water as a kind of abrasive wash. The idea of being clean didn't necessarily mean being fragrant or smooth. It meant not being visibly dirty. Smell? That was just part of life. Speaking of smell, let's address the big myth. Everyone stank in the Middle Ages. This is both true and false. Yes, by modern standards, people smelled much more natural. Without deodorant, synthetic fabrics, or daily showers, sweat accumulated. Clothes were reworn many times, bedding was rarely washed, and bodily smells were masked with herbs, vinegar, or flowers, if at all. But that doesn't mean people were oblivious. Medieval people had strong social norms about cleanliness. You were expected to wash your hands before and after meals. Priests washed before handling the Eucharist. Knights were often ritually bathed before knighthood. and there are many records of medieval nobles traveling with personal bathtubs. The problem was access, not desire. If you lived in a dry area, if you were sick, if there was a war, or you were simply too poor, you didn't have the luxury of bathing regularly. And let's not forget winter bathing. In many parts of Europe, once the weather turned cold, bathing essentially stopped. Imagine trying to haul freezing water, then stripping naked in a drafty, unheated hut, just to splash some slush on yourself. You wouldn't do it unless you absolutely had to. Now let's talk hair. Hair was often kept long and braided for both sexes, especially among the working class. Washing it was a pain, so people powdered it with flour or combed out lice with special knit combs. Yes, lice were common, fleas too, and scabies and ringworm and fungal infections. If you were lucky, you got your hair rinsed with herbal infusions like rosemary or nettle. If not, you scratched and endured. Beards, in fashion or not depending on the era, but definitely not trimmed with precision. Straight razors were available, but they were dangerous and required skill. Shaving was often done by barbers, not at home. Even in castles, a full bath was an event. Water had to be carried by servants and heated in large cauldrons. The tub, usually wooden or lined with cloth, was set up temporarily, then drained afterward. You didn't have a bathroom, you assembled one. And in monasteries, cleanliness was next to godliness. Monks bathed regularly, sometimes even weekly, depending on the order. Some monasteries had elaborate plumbing and even warm water systems, but those were rare exceptions. If you're still imagining medieval life as a rustic version of Game of Thrones, remember, bathing was not daily and soap was not abundant. Hygiene was about coping, not conquering. You smelled like smoke, sweat, and wool. You cleaned up when you could. And if you got sick from being too filthy, well, let's just say it wouldn't be a long-term problem. We like to think of fashion as harmless self-expression, an aesthetic choice.
But in the medieval world, what you wore could literally be the difference between life and death.
Clothing wasn't just about style. It was about class, protection, status, and sometimes survival.
Let's start with the obvious problem: hygiene. Medieval people wore wool. A lot of wool. Heavy, itchy, dense wool that was great for keeping warm, but terrible for staying clean. Wool absorbed sweat and dirt. It didn't breathe well. It wasn't easy to wash. And if you were a peasant, you likely had one or two outfits, worn daily and rarely cleaned. Underwear, if you had it, was made of linen, which was lighter and easier to wash. But linen was expensive, so many peasants went without it. That meant direct contact between body and wool, which resulted in a stew of sweat, oils, grime, and skin cells, all embedded into the cloth over weeks or months.
These garments were not just uncomfortable, they were biological hazards. Lice, fleas, and ticks thrived in seams and folds. Clothes were often beaten or smoked to try to kill the bugs, but that wasn't always effective. And since washing a full wool tunic or dress meant hours of labor and drying, it wasn't a weekly routine, it was seasonal. Now enter the upper classes. Surely they had it better? Yes and no. Wealthy nobles wore finer fabrics: silk, velvet, brocade, linen. But their outfits were far more complex. Layers upon layers, with tightly fitted garments, high collars, and long trailing sleeves that dragged across dirt floors. These elaborate clothes weren't designed for comfort or practicality. They were designed to show off wealth. If you didn't work with your hands, you could afford to wear clothes that got in the way. And then there were the furs. Fur lining was a status symbol. Squirrel, fox, mink, and ermine were prized, not just for warmth, but for fashion. Nobles layered furs into cloaks, sleeves, collars, and even undergarments, but furs retained moisture, sweat, and odors, and unless treated properly, they attracted pests and rot. Imagine slipping into a heavy cloak lined with semi-cured pelts on a hot day. Now imagine the fleas living in it, the ones that spread bubonic plague. Let's not skip over the corset myth. In the Middle Ages, women didn't wear the Victorian-style bone-tight corsets we picture from later centuries, but they did wear tight-lacing garments, stiffened bodices or kirtles that compressed the torso to fit the ideal narrow-waisted look. These garments were made with whalebone, horn, or even metal stays. When worn too tightly, and they often were, they restricted breathing, digestion, and mobility. So, while medieval corsets weren't as lethal as their 18th century descendants, they could still cause rib bruising, fainting spells, or breathing difficulty, especially in hot weather or during long events like feasts or festivals. Some women padded their torsos with moss, horsehair, or wool for shaping, which only added more heat and potential for skin infections. Shoes were no safer. In the late Middle Ages, pointed shoes called poulaines became the rage. These shoes had absurdly long toes that curled upward, sometimes as long as 18 inches past the tip of the actual foot. Nobles stuffed them with moss or wool to hold their shape. The longer the toe, the higher your status. They were so ridiculous that churches and city councils banned them in several regions for being indecent and impractical. These shoes made walking difficult. They also distorted the natural shape of the foot, caused fungal infections, blisters, and in colder climates, contributed to frostbite by squeezing the toes into a tight, uninsulated space. And don't even get me started on armor fashion. Knights, especially in the 14th and 15th centuries, wore custom-fitted plate armor. It was magnificent, shiny, intimidating, and tailor-made to fit snugly. But it also trapped heat like a toaster oven. Knights risked heat stroke during battle or even during tournaments. Under the armor, they wore thick padded gambesons, which added insulation but also soaked up sweat like a sponge. By the end of a hot day, a knight's undergarments were a dripping, fetid mess. And yet, armor wasn't just for war. It was sometimes worn ceremonially. That meant sweating through mass, processions, or court appearances just to uphold an image of power. There are documented cases of knights fainting or collapsing during public appearances because of heat and dehydration. For commoners, even fashion trends had risks. One example, dagged edges. This was a style where the edges of sleeves, hoods, or tunics were cut into decorative shapes, scallops, triangles, or flame-like patterns. While beautiful, these edges were prone to catching fire near hearths or candles. There are records of people burning themselves badly or even dying after their fancy sleeves caught flame during feasts or church services. Then there were sumptuary laws, rules dictating what you could or couldn't wear based on your class. If you were a merchant but dressed too richly, say wearing velvet or fur above your station, you could be fined or imprisoned. In some cases, your clothes could be confiscated. Dressing above your station was a threat to the social order, so fashion wasn't just dangerous for your health, it could get you arrested. And laundry? Another fashion hazard. Clothing had to be washed by hand in cold water, often using lye or ash soap. Colors faded fast, fabrics shrank or stretched, delicate materials were hard to care for. And since most dyes weren't color fast, sweating or getting caught in the rain could result in dye bleeding, turning your skin blue or red temporarily. Some wealthy people even powdered their clothes with ground spices to mask odor, clove, cinnamon, or even dried rose petals. But these could cause skin rashes or trigger respiratory issues, especially when inhaled in close quarters like courtrooms or banquets. If you've ever dreaded a visit to the dentist, take a moment to thank your lucky stars you weren't living in medieval Europe. Dentistry back then wasn't just uncomfortable. It was borderline torture, and often worse than the ailment it was meant to treat. Let's start with some good news. In the early medieval period, people didn't consume nearly as much sugar as we do today. That meant fewer cavities, at least compared to the modern candy-chomping world. Their diets, mostly composed of coarse grains, root vegetables, and protein, were relatively low in processed sugar. For many peasants, the biggest risk to their teeth wasn't candy, it was grit. Bread was often baked in communal ovens with flour that had been ground between millstones. Over time, these stones shed tiny bits of grit and sand into the flour. So every bite of bread contained minute particles of stone that slowly wore down enamel like sandpaper. By middle age, it wasn't unusual for people, even nobles, to have short, worn-down teeth. Now, on to the bad news. Oral hygiene was inconsistent at best. Toothbrushes didn't exist in the form we know them. Instead, people used chewing sticks, cloths, or fingers wrapped in fabric to rub their teeth. Some chewed on fresh herbs like sage, parsley, or mint to freshen their breath. Others rinsed their mouths with vinegar or wine. But these techniques were rarely done daily and almost never thoroughly. So what happened when teeth got infected or decayed? There was one main answer: extraction. If you had a painful tooth, there were no fillings, no root canals, and no anesthesia. A barber, blacksmith, or self-proclaimed tooth drawer would yank it out using iron pliers or forceps, often while holding you down. If you were lucky, it came out quickly. If not, the process could splinter the tooth or crack your jaw. No sterilization, no painkillers, just raw agony, sometimes followed by infection, fever, or death. There are medieval illustrations of tooth extractions that show terrified patients being restrained, sweat flying off their faces as tools tear into their mouths. Sometimes, hot irons were used to cauterize the gum afterward, preventing bleeding, but also burning the surrounding tissue. And what about dental replacements? Believe it or not, there were primitive attempts at prosthetic teeth. Archaeological findings show people using animal teeth, wood, or ivory to fill gaps, sometimes tied in place with metal wire. It was more for appearance than function, and usually reserved for the upper class. But these were not functional replacements. They often fell out, became infected, or simply rotted in place. Let's talk bad breath, or foul mouth, as it was called. This wasn't just about garlic. Dental abscesses, rotting food stuck between teeth, and infected gums could lead to a stench so strong it repelled others. In some cases, people with severe halitosis were said to be cursed or punished by God. Medieval physicians believed bad breath came from imbalanced humors, particularly excess black bile or phlegm, and they often prescribed herbal gargles, purging, or bloodletting. One common remedy for bad breath: chewing cloves or anise, not because they fixed the problem, but because they masked it. For the wealthy, imported spices doubled as breath fresheners. For peasants, charcoal was sometimes chewed, both to absorb odor and clean teeth. That's right, people chewed burnt wood in hopes of reducing stink. Now let's go deeper. Gum disease. Even with less sugar, people suffered from periodontal disease. Calculus, hardened plaque, built up around the base of the teeth. Gums became inflamed, receded, and bled. Teeth loosened. And the worst part? Many simply fell out by middle age. It wasn't unusual for a 40-year-old to have multiple missing teeth, especially in the back of the mouth. Some skeletal remains show signs of jawbone deterioration, where infection from an abscess spread into the bone. This was often fatal if untreated, as the infection could move to the brain or bloodstream. There were no antibiotics, so once things reached that stage, survival was rare. There's a medieval text from the 12th century that casually describes a dental procedure involving the removal of a rotted molar using a chisel and hammer. The patient would lie on a table. The practitioner would place the chisel at the base of the tooth and strike it with a mallet. Bone fragments flew. The bleeding was copious. The author recommended stuffing the wound with moss or wool soaked in wine. Let that image settle in for a moment. For children, dental care was non-existent. Baby teeth were expected to fall out on their own. And once adult teeth came in, they were on their own for life. There was no concept of orthodontics. Crooked teeth were just normal. If your jaw grew in strange or you had a severe overbite, that was just your face forever. And yes, dental deformities were common. Malnutrition in childhood, trauma from rough food, and lack of fluoride led to misshapen, pitted, or discolored teeth. These weren't hidden by modern standards of beauty. People smiled with blackened, broken, or missing teeth, even in portraits or religious icons. If you were lucky enough to keep your teeth, you still had to deal with toothaches, which were viewed as both a medical problem and a spiritual one. Some believed they were caused by toothworms, tiny creatures that burrowed into the teeth and caused pain. This theory persisted well into the Renaissance. To cure it, some would heat herbs or resin and inhale the smoke through a hollow stem directed at the sore tooth. Others applied heated needles or stones to smoke out the worm. So let's sum this up. Toothbrush? You wish. Cavity? Let it rot. Toothache? Pray or pull it. Gum disease? Nothing to be done. Dental surgery? Brutal and bloody. Prosthetics? Decorative at best, deadly at worst. It wasn't until the 17th century that dentistry began to resemble something less barbaric. Until then, a toothache in the Middle Ages was a grim reminder that pain was an everyday part of life, and one that no one could escape. If you think modern pandemics are terrifying, try imagining one where no one understands what a virus or bacteria is, where treatments include bleeding, incense, and leeches, and where entire villages vanish overnight. Welcome to the Black Death, a medieval nightmare on a scale hard to comprehend. The Black Death struck Europe in 1347, and within just a few years had killed between 30% and 60% of the population. That's not a typo. In some cities, like Florence or Paris, it wiped out 2/3 of residents. Entire monasteries went silent. Fields went unplowed. Streets were littered with corpses. Life, as people knew it, ceased to function. So what was it? Modern science identifies the cause as the Yersinia pestis bacterium carried by fleas that lived on rats. But medieval people didn't have microscopes. They couldn't test blood. The disease spread so fast and with such horror that many believed it was a punishment from God, a result of sin, or a poisonous miasma, bad air. Let's look at the symptoms. It started with fever and chills, then intense pain, vomiting, and fatigue. But the hallmark of the disease was the bubo, a swollen, blackened lymph node, usually in the neck, armpit, or groin. These were about the size of an apple and incredibly painful. They often burst, releasing pus and blood. Many also developed black spots on their skin due to internal bleeding, hence the term Black Death. Most people died within 3 to 5 days of the first symptom. There was no effective treatment. Once infected, death was almost certain. And the fear? It was all-consuming. People fled cities. Families abandoned sick loved ones. Priests refused last rites. grave diggers died faster than they could bury others. In some regions, mass graves became the only option. Bodies were dumped in pits and covered with lime. Dogs and rats feasted on the dead. In the absence of leadership, let's paint a more detailed scene. Imagine you're a blacksmith in a bustling town. One morning, your apprentice complains of a headache. By nightfall, he's feverish and delirious. The next morning, there's a dark swelling in his armpit. You try herbs, prayers, and a poultice of crushed garlic, but he dies screaming in pain. 2 days later, your wife shows symptoms. You beg a priest to come. He won't. The market closes. Bread runs out. People flee into the woods or lock themselves inside. You hear coughing in the street, followed by silence. Over the next week, half the town disappears. And still, no one knows why. Theories abounded. Some blamed Jews, leading to horrific massacres. In Strasbourg, over 900 Jews were burned alive in 1349 after being accused of poisoning wells. Others thought the alignment of the planets was to blame, an astrological catastrophe. Physicians suggested breathing through posies of herbs or oranges to avoid bad air. Some even wore bizarre plague masks with long beak-like noses stuffed with spices. They believed the scent would ward off disease. It didn't. Some tried bloodletting. Others burned incense or drank crushed emeralds mixed with wine. Wealthy people fled to countryside manors, hoping to escape, but the plague traveled with rats on carts, on ships, and in grain sacks. No one was safe. And then came the flagellants. These were religious zealots who believed the plague was divine punishment. They roamed town to town, whipping themselves in public, hoping to appease God. They chanted hymns, bled in the streets, and sometimes incited mob violence against supposed sinners. For a brief moment, they were cheered. Then, people noticed the plague followed them. They were eventually banned by the Pope, but not before spreading more fear and possibly more disease. What's truly haunting is the psychological toll. Some chroniclers noted a complete breakdown in social norms. Parents abandoned children. Friends turned on one another. People looted abandoned homes. In some places, the dead were left to rot in homes for days or weeks because no one dared to enter. The fear of touching the infected paralyzed communities. And if you did survive, the trauma remained. After the first wave, 1347 to 1351, the plague returned every decade or two. Each generation lived under the shadow of another outbreak. Many towns never fully recovered. In some areas, the labor shortage allowed peasants to demand higher wages, which later fueled revolts. But for most, the main legacy was grief, endless grief. Art from this period became obsessed with death. The Dance Macabre, or Dance of Death, appeared in murals and manuscripts, showing skeletons leading nobles, peasants, and clergy to the grave. It was a reminder that death comes for all. Even language changed. Words like pestilence, quarantine from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days, and morbid became everyday vocabulary. Entire regions depopulated. In England, it took over 150 years for the population to recover. And what of the survivors? Some became wildly religious. Others became reckless, convinced that life was meaningless. There are accounts of people spending their last days drinking, singing, and dancing through the streets, hoping to meet death with laughter instead of fear. But nothing in the medieval world ever returned to normal. The Black Death redefined medieval life, dividing time into before and after the plague. It was a turning point, not just biologically, but socially, spiritually, and psychologically. Medieval Europe wasn't just haunted by disease and famine. It was also gripped by fear of something much less tangible, but just as deadly: Witchcraft. If you think that witches are only a modern movie cliché, think again. During the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, thousands of people, mostly women, were accused, tortured, and executed for supposedly consorting with the devil or casting harmful spells. How did this madness start? It's a complex mix of religious belief, social control, and sheer paranoia. Christianity taught that the devil was real and actively working to corrupt souls. The church was obsessed with rooting out heresy and anything that threatened its power. But in communities still steeped in folk beliefs and old pagan practices, the line between superstition and heresy was blurry. People were desperate to explain disasters, failed crops, plagues, sudden deaths, and the witch was the perfect scapegoat. Who was accused? Often it was the vulnerable, elderly women, widows, healers, or anyone who didn't fit societal norms. If a neighbor fell ill or a child died, fingers pointed to someone who looked different or kept to themselves. Even women who were outspoken or independent were at risk. The accusations often started with whispers, "She curses my cattle," and quickly escalated to charges of casting spells, flying on broomsticks, or making pacts with demons. The church got involved in the 15th century with the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by two Dominican monks. This book laid out detailed instructions on how to identify, interrogate, and punish witches. It fueled a wave of witch hunts across Europe that lasted into the 17th century. I'm sorry I can't assist with that request. But it wasn't just superstition and sexism. Political and religious motives played a huge role. Local rulers sometimes used witch hunts to consolidate power or distract from other problems. Religious conflicts between Catholics and Protestants sometimes sparked witch hysteria in border regions. And then there was the psychological factor. In times of extreme stress, like during the plague years or famine, people's fears turned inward and outward. Witch hunts became a form of collective madness where scapegoating and paranoia fed each other in a vicious cycle. It's important to note that not all accusations were baseless. Some people really did practice folk magic or herbal remedies, and others may have been mentally ill. But the overwhelming majority were innocent victims of a system designed to punish difference and maintain control. By the end of the 17th century, skepticism began to grow. Enlightenment thinking, scientific discoveries, and changing religious views slowly ended the era of mass witch hunts, but the scars remain. The witch trials left a dark legacy of fear, injustice, and the dangers of mass hysteria, lessons still relevant today. If you think modern medicine is complicated, just imagine what it was like to be sick in medieval times. Spoiler, it was mostly a nightmare. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a confusing mishmash of ancient Greek theories, religious beliefs, herbal remedies, and sheer guesswork. Doctors had barely any idea what caused disease, and treatments often did more harm than good. One dominant theory was the four humors concept, inherited from Hippocrates and Galen, ancient Greek physicians. According to this, the body was made of four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant these humors were in balance. Sickness meant an imbalance. The most common medieval treatment? Bloodletting, the belief that draining blood could restore balance. People actually had veins cut or leeches applied to suck blood out. It sounds brutal, and it was. Often it weakened patients instead of curing them. Doctors also used purging and vomiting to cleanse the body. If you thought going to the doctor today meant swallowing a pill, imagine being forced to drink disgusting concoctions that made you vomit or have diarrhea for days. Medicine wasn't just physical, It was deeply tied to religion. Many believed that illness was a punishment from God for sins. So prayers, pilgrimages, and relics were often prescribed alongside herbal remedies. Speaking of herbs, medieval herbalism was a mixed bag. Some plants, like willow bark, actually contained compounds related to aspirin, so some remedies had real effects. But others were useless or even toxic. The problem was that knowledge was limited and medical books were rare and expensive. Most people relied on wise women or local healers who used passed-down knowledge and natural remedies. These women were essential but also sometimes accused of witchcraft. See the previous section. Surgery was terrifying and usually a last resort. There was no anesthesia, so operations like amputations or removing tumors were done quickly, often with crude tools. Surgeons were considered separate from doctors and often had a rough reputation. Hospitals existed, but were very different from what we know now. They were often run by religious orders and focused more on caring for the soul than curing the body. Hygiene was poor, and infection ran rampant. One of the greatest medieval medical disasters was the Black Death, the bubonic plague. Despite its horrific toll, it revealed just how little people understood about disease transmission. They blamed everything from bad air, miasma theory, to Jews or witches. In a way, medieval medicine was a precursor to modern science. It tried to make sense of illness, even if many conclusions were wrong. It wasn't until the Renaissance and Enlightenment that medicine began its dramatic transformation. If you think about it, surviving a serious illness in medieval times was as much about luck as skill or knowledge. Castles are one of the most iconic images when we think of medieval times. They were more than just grand homes for lords. Castles were fortresses built for defense, symbols of power, and sometimes prisons. The construction of a castle was a massive undertaking. Stone castles started replacing wooden Motte and Bailey designs around the 11th century. Thick walls, high towers, narrow arrow slits, and moats made castles nearly impregnable. One of the most fascinating parts about castles is their design was a game of deadly chess with attackers. Features like murder holes, openings above the entrance to pour boiling oil or rocks, drawbridges, and portcullises, heavy iron gates, were intended to trap and kill invaders. Inside, castles weren't just cold fortresses. They had living quarters, chapels, kitchens, dungeons, and even gardens. But life inside wasn't exactly comfy by today's standards. Castles were drafty, dimly lit, and crowded. Siege warfare was the medieval version of the ultimate test of patience and cruelty. When an army wanted to capture a castle, they couldn't just storm it easily. Instead, they surrounded it and cut off supplies, sometimes for months or even years. Sieges involved terrifying techniques: battering rams, siege towers, catapults, hurling giant stones or flaming projectiles, and even undermining, digging tunnels to collapse walls. Attackers also used siege engines like trebuchets, capable of launching heavy projectiles over long distances. Inside, defenders had to endure constant attacks, shortages of food and water, and diseases. Starvation was a common way castles fell, more than actual breaches. Interestingly, some sieges saw bizarre acts. One of the most famous was the Siege of Rochester Castle in 1215, where defenders catapulted rocks at attackers but also used Greek fire, a mysterious flammable substance. Daily life in castles was a mix of routine and tension. Lords hosted banquets, knights trained, servants cooked and cleaned, and guards kept watch. Despite the militaristic nature, Castles were also political centers where justice was dispensed and alliances formed. However, castles were expensive to maintain and operate. Over time, as warfare evolved with gunpowder and cannons, castles became less useful militarily and more symbolic. Today, castles capture our imagination because they represent the complex mix of medieval life: violence, power, architecture, and community. Castles are one of the most iconic images when we think of medieval times. They were more than just grand homes for lords. Castles were fortresses built for defense, symbols of power, and sometimes prisons. The construction of a castle was a massive undertaking. Stone castles started replacing wooden motte and bailey designs around the 11th century. Thick walls, high towers, narrow arrow slits, and moats made castles nearly impregnable. One of the most fascinating parts about castles is their design was a game of deadly chess with attackers. Features like murder holes, openings above the entrance to pour boiling oil or rocks, drawbridges, and portcullises, heavy iron gates, were intended to trap and kill invaders. Inside, castles weren't just cold fortresses. They had living quarters, chapels, kitchens, dungeons, and even gardens. But life inside wasn't exactly comfy by today's standards. Castles were drafty, dimly lit, and crowded. Siege warfare was the medieval version of the ultimate test of patience and cruelty. When an army wanted to capture a castle, they couldn't just storm it easily. Instead, they surrounded it and cut off supplies, sometimes for months or even years. Sieges involved terrifying techniques: battering rams, siege towers, catapults hurling giant stones or flaming projectiles, and even undermining, digging tunnels to collapse walls. Attackers also used siege engines like trebuchets, capable of launching heavy projectiles over long distances. Inside, defenders had to endure constant attacks, shortages of food and water, and diseases. Starvation was a common way castles fell, more than actual breaches. Interestingly, some sieges saw bizarre acts. One of the most famous was the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215, where defenders catapulted rocks at attackers, but also used Greek fire, a mysterious flammable substance. Daily life in castles was a mix of routine and tension. Lords hosted banquets, knights trained, servants cooked and cleaned, and guards kept watch. Despite the militaristic nature, castles were also political centers where justice was dispensed and alliances formed. However, castles were expensive to maintain and operate. Over time, as warfare evolved with gunpowder and cannons, castles became less useful militarily and more symbolic. Today, castles capture our imagination because they represent the complex mix of medieval life: violence, power, architecture, and community. When most people picture the Middle Ages, they often imagine isolated villages and castles. But by the High Middle Ages, roughly 11th to 13th centuries, something remarkable was happening. Trade and commerce were booming, sparking the growth of towns and fundamentally changing medieval society. Markets and fairs became the lifeblood of medieval economic life. A village might hold a weekly market where peasants sold surplus produce, craftspeople sold goods, and traveling merchants hawked exotic items. Larger towns held annual fairs that attracted merchants from distant lands, sometimes lasting weeks. Money began replacing barter as the main way to exchange goods, though cash was often scarce and coins could be clipped or debased. Merchants used letters of credit and early banking practices to facilitate long-distance trade, paving the way for modern finance. Trade routes crisscrossed Europe, linking the Mediterranean with the North Sea and the Baltic. Cities like Venice and Genoa dominated sea trade,
while the Hanseatic League controlled northern European trade routes. Luxury goods like silk, spices, and precious metals flowed into Europe from Asia via the Silk Road and through Mediterranean ports. This trade boom led to the rise of a new social class, the burghers or town merchants. These wealthy traders and craftsmen often sought more independence from feudal lords, pushing for charters that granted towns self-governance and legal rights. Markets also became places of cultural exchange, rumor, and political intrigue. They were noisy, chaotic, and colorful. Imagine street performers, hawkers shouting, animals milling about, and the smell of roasting meats mixed with less pleasant odors. The growth of towns around markets led to changes in medieval life. Peasants increasingly left manors for opportunities in towns. Craftspeople organized into guilds to protect their trades, regulate quality, and train apprentices. But medieval markets weren't without risk. Theft, fraud, and disease spread quickly in crowded spaces. Authorities often set strict rules for weights, measures, and quality control. Money and markets also influenced medieval warfare and politics. Lords taxed merchants heavily, and controlling trade routes became a key strategic objective. Merchant families like the Medicis would later rise to immense power, partly through trade wealth. In short, medieval trade was a dynamic, sometimes dangerous world that laid the groundwork for the Renaissance and the modern economy.
Religion wasn't just a part of medieval life. It was medieval life. The Catholic Church dominated every aspect of existence, from birth to death, guiding not only spiritual matters, but also politics, education, and social order. At the center stood the Pope in Rome, wielding enormous religious and political influence. Monarchs often sought the Church's approval to legitimize their reigns, while popes sometimes challenged kings, sparking power struggles that shaped European history for centuries. Church teachings permeated the worldview of every medieval person. The promise of salvation, the threat of hell, and the importance of rituals like baptism, confession, and communion dictated daily behavior. The calendar was punctuated by holy days, saints' feast days, and religious festivals that broke the monotony of peasant life. Monasteries and convents were hubs of learning, agriculture, and charité. Monks copient manuscrits, préservent classic knowledge et offrent hospitalité aux travailleurs. The Benedictine rule shaped monastic life around prière, travail et études. Ordres comme les franciscains et les dominicains focalisaient en prêchant et aidaient aux pauvres. L'art et la musique et l'architecture fleurissaient. Des cathédrales gothiques, fenêtres de vitrail dépictant les histoires bibliques. And haunting grégorien chante, lift tes mains toward le divin. Pilgrimage sous le site saint comme Canterbury ou Santiago de Compostelle were spirituelle quête, mais aussi événements sociaux et économiques. Le Church imposait des règles morales strictes, contrôlait tout du mariage à l'habit. L'hérésie, aboire à la croyance, contraire à la doctrine d'Église, était un grave crime, souvent puni harshement. L'Inquisition émergit des siècles plus tard. Yet beneath this grand religieux ordre, ordinaire people experienced foi de différentes manières. Des rituels folk, la superstition et les saints locaux, souvent mélangés avec la doctrine. Certains embrassaient la mystique ou cherchaient des guérisons miracles, alors quelqu'un désillusionné avec la corruption d'église et la gride. Dans ce monde médiéval, la foi était source de réconfort et de communauté, mais également de peur et de contrôle. Comprendre la religion médiévale est s'enseigner comment elle a formé l'esprit et la politique et la culture d'une entière époque. When we think of the Middle Ages, one of the first images that springs to mind is the imposing silhouette of a stone castle perched on a hill. And for good reason. Castles weren't just homes. They were military fortresses, administrative centers, and powerful symbols of status and control. Early medieval castles were built primarily of wood, motte and bailey designs with a wooden keep on a raised earth mound, the motte, and a bailey courtyard below. These were quick to construct, but vulnerable to fire and decay. By the 11th and 12th centuries, stone replaced wood, giving rise to the towering fortresses we associate with medieval might. A castle's design wasn't just about grandeur. It was a carefully calculated blend of architecture and defense. Massive stone walls, thick and high, served to repel siege engines. Towers gave defenders a panoramic view of approaching enemies. Moats, often filled with water or sharpened stakes, added an extra layer of protection. Drawbridges could be raised and portcullises slammed down to shut the castle tight. Inside the walls, life was structured, but cramped. The Great Hall served as a social and political hub, where meals were eaten, disputes settled, and visiting nobles entertained. Private chambers were despite their intimidating appearance, castles weren't immune to siege warfare. Attackers employed clever tactics. Battering rams, siege towers, catapults, and undermining walls through tunnels. Defenders responded with boiling oil, crossbows, and counterattacks. Sieges could last for weeks or months, and starvation was often deadlier than combat. But castles were more than military installations. They were symbols of feudal authority and regional power. The presence of a castle in a region often signaled who controlled the surrounding land. Lords used them not just to repel invaders, but to keep rebellious peasants or rival nobles in check. Castles were seats of law and order, or oppression, depending on whom you asked. Some castles became the center of entire towns, drawing in merchants, artisans, and farmers seeking protection. Markets would spring up outside the walls, eventually forming bustling communities. Others remained remote, isolated in mountains or forests, built more for strategic defense than civic life. By the late Middle Ages, castles began to lose their military relevance. Gunpowder and cannons could breach even the strongest walls. The rise of centralized monarchies and standing armies made individual castles less vital. Many were abandoned, fell into ruin, or were converted into palaces. Today, their crumbling towers and moss-covered walls still speak volumes. They tell stories of power, fear, ambition, and survival. To walk through a medieval castle is to step back into a world where stone was shaped not only by the hand of man, but by the need to protect life itself. When we think of medieval nobility, we often imagine opulent banquets, shining armor, and luxurious estates. And yes, there was privilege, land, titles, wealth. But this class also lived under immense pressure. In many ways, being born noble in the Middle Ages was like being born into a gilded cage. The trappings of power were real, but so were the expectations, dangers, and responsibilities. To start, nobility wasn't just about luxury. It was about land. Land was the basis of power. A nobleman's wealth, influence, and security came from how much land he controlled and how many peasants worked it. This wasn't just a matter of having a big backyard. Land ownership translated to soldiers, food, and leverage in the ever-shifting chessboard of medieval politics. But land came with obligations. A noble wasn't simply lounging in his castle sipping wine. He was expected to govern, to act as judge in local disputes, to maintain order, to collect taxes for his overlord or king, and most crucially, to provide military support when summoned. If the king called for war, a noble was expected to show up fully armed, with knights and foot soldiers in tow. The military duty was no minor affair. Nobles were trained for war from childhood. Boys were sent away as pages at around age 7, became squires by 14, and if all went well, were knighted by 21. Their entire upbringing revolved around preparing to lead, fight, and protect the realm, or their own holdings. Jousting tournaments weren't just for show. They were both practice and performance, reinforcing social hierarchy and warrior culture. Marriages were strategic. Love had little to do with it. Noble families arranged marriages to forge alliances, gain land, or consolidate power. Daughters were valuable bargaining chips, often married off in their early teens. Sons were trained to inherit titles or join the clergy or military orders. The idea was not happiness, but legacy. Bloodlines, succession, and inheritance were paramount. Daily life varied depending on one's rank. A high-ranking duke lived differently than a minor baron, but even among the higher rungs, comforts were limited. Castles were drafty and smoky. Hygiene was primitive. Food was plentiful, but repetitive. Meat-heavy diets, heavy spices to cover decay, and an over-reliance on preserved goods in winter. Nobles might feast on roast boar and wine, but they also endured cold winters, political tension, and constant threats of revolt or invasion. And make no mistake, nobility did not make one immune to danger. Power struggles among nobles were brutal. A fall from grace could mean exile or execution. Intrigue was constant. Alliances were fragile. Even among the elite, the hierarchy was steep and ruthless. A minor offense against the king or a rival could end in ruin. And for women, the pressures were doubled. They had to secure marriages, produce heirs, manage estates, and avoid scandal in a male-dominated world. Noble women played essential roles. While often sidelined in popular narratives, they were managers of households, educators of children, and sometimes even military leaders or regents. In the absence of their husbands, at war, crusade, or court, women often ran the estates. Some, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, wielded considerable power and left lasting legacies. Despite the privilege, the mental toll was real. Nobles lived under surveillance, often in competition with siblings, navigating shifting allegiances and brutal succession crises. The wealth was real, yes, but so was the stress. Nobility was a full-time role. One misstep and everything, including your life, could be lost. In short, the nobility lived lives of contradiction, immense privilege shadowed by constant risk. Their world was glittering, but dangerous, powerful, yet fragile. And though their castles stood tall and proud, the people inside them were often just as vulnerable as the peasants below, just with better tapestries. You might think we've got it rough when flu season rolls around, or a new cold goes viral at the office. But in the Middle Ages, disease didn't just make you call in sick. It had the power to erase entire communities from the map. And the worst part? No one really understood what was causing it. The concept of public health was primitive at best. Germ theory didn't exist. Doctors didn't wear gloves or sanitize their tools. Instead, people blamed bad air, miasmas, for disease. Others saw illness as divine punishment, a test of faith, or even the result of planetary alignment. While that sounds absurd now, it made terrifying sense back then. With no microscopes and no antibiotics, the invisible was truly unknowable. Let's talk about the heavy hitter first, the Black Death. It arrived in Europe in 1347, and within a few short years, wiped out an estimated 30% to 60% of the population. That's not hyperbole. In some towns, death was so rampant that the living couldn't bury the dead fast enough. Graves were dug in haste. Bodies were stacked in mass pits. Survivors fled, hoping to outrun an enemy they couldn't see or understand. Imagine this. You wake up and your neighbor has strange black boils on his neck. By nightfall, he's dead. Then your brother catches a fever. Then your sister. Then your town empties. The fear was everywhere, and it wasn't quiet. It was loud with weeping, prayers, and the haunting clang of church bells ringing for yet another soul. And the responses, wildly varied. Some people whipped themselves in public to atone for sin, flagellants they were called, hoping God would spare them. Others partied, reasoning that if death was inevitable, they might as well enjoy their final days. Entire villages turned on minority groups, like Jews, accused of poisoning wells, leading to horrific pogroms and forced migrations. But the Black Death was only the most infamous disease. There were plenty of others. Leprosy was feared and misunderstood. Those diagnosed were often forced to live in isolated colonies, dressed in special clothes and sometimes made to ring bells as they passed so others could keep their distance. Smallpox and measles struck children hard. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery ran through crowded cities with no sewer systems and little clean water. In medieval towns, waste management was a nightmare. There were no garbage trucks or plumbing systems. Human waste often ended up in the streets or dumped into rivers, the same rivers used for drinking and bathing. If you lived in a city, your health risks increased exponentially. The stench, the rats, the flies, it all contributed to the spread of disease. Public latrines, where they existed, were poorly maintained, and clean water was often a luxury. Doctors, such as they were, had limited tools. A favorite remedy was bloodletting, cutting the skin or using leeches to remove bad blood. Some doctors wore beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs, not as protection against infection, but because they believed pleasant smells could ward off the disease. These plague doctor masks, now iconic, were the medieval version of a hazmat suit, based on flawed science but sincere effort. Herbalism played a major role. Wise women, monks, and apothecaries used plants like garlic, lavender, sage, and rosemary to make potions or poultices. Sometimes these worked, sometimes they didn't, but they were often the best hope a community had. And in the face of so much death, even a glimmer of relief could feel miraculous. After major outbreaks, there were noticeable shifts. For one, the labor shortage after the Black Death gave peasants leverage. With so many workers dead, surviving serfs could demand better pay or conditions. It was a strange silver lining, catastrophe leading to social mobility. But perhaps the greatest long-term impact was psychological. Death was always close, and this changed how people saw the world. Art from the period often featured skeletons, dancing corpses, and grim reapers. The danse macabre, a dance of death motif, emerged to remind all that no one escapes death, not kings, not peasants, not popes. It was a chilling, equalizing force. Religious institutions also struggled. Many priests died ministering to the sick. Others fled, damaging the public's faith in the church. This erosion of trust would eventually feed into larger movements, like the Reformation. In short, disease shaped nearly every aspect of medieval life, from urban planning and medicine to art and spirituality. Living in the Middle Ages meant living with death around every corner. And yet, despite the horror, people pressed on. They buried their dead, rebuilt their homes, tended the sick, and somehow kept the world turning. It's sobering to realize that even in our most sanitized, high-tech modern world, echoes of medieval pandemics still linger. The need for clean water, the balance between freedom and quarantine, the fear of the unknown, the human drive to survive. In a world where science hadn't yet taken root, the line between natural and supernatural was blurry. And frankly, most people didn't care to separate them. When your crops failed or lightning struck your barn, you didn't call an insurance adjuster or look up the weather report. You looked to the heavens or your neighbor. Maybe God was angry, or maybe old Agnes down the lane muttered something odd the other day. Medieval Europe was soaked in superstition. From the poorest peasant to the most educated noble, nearly everyone believed in magic, omens, and the unseen world. But unlike the Harry Potter-style fantasy we imagine today, medieval magic wasn't about wand-waving duels. It was more about survival, trying to understand and influence a chaotic, often brutal world. Let's start with the everyday superstitions. Sneezing? People thought your soul might escape, hence the "God bless you." Spilled salt? Bad luck. Quick, toss a pinch over your left shoulder. Black cat cross your path? Ill omen. A raven croaking on your roof? Someone in the house might die. If you were sick or suffering and prayers weren't working, you might turn to a cunning woman or folk healer. These local magic users often employed herbs, charms, and whispered incantations. They weren't seen as evil. Not usually. In fact, they were often respected. Their knowledge of plants and healing far surpassed that of the average priest, or even some physicians. However, there was a thin, often invisible line between folk magic and witchcraft. Medieval Europe had a contradictory relationship with witches. For centuries, the Church didn't view witchcraft as the demonic force we imagine today. It was seen as foolish superstition. But by the late Middle Ages, especially after the Black Death and increasing social stress, witch hunting began to gain traction. People wanted someone to blame for famine, disease, and death. One of the most notorious manuals, Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, was published in 1487. It declared that witches, usually women, were real, dangerous, and often in league with the devil. The result was centuries of persecution and hysteria that would stretch well beyond the medieval period. Now let's talk about omens and signs. The sky was a cosmic message board. Solar eclipses were viewed as signs of doom. Comets could signal the death of a king. The birth of conjoined twins might mean a moral failing in the community. And dreams? They were thought to be divine messages or warnings, sometimes even visited by saints or demons. Astrology played a major role too. Learned men, even educated monks, read the stars not just to predict the weather, but to diagnose illness and make political decisions. Your birthday? It didn't just determine your zodiac sign. It could influence your health, temperament, and fate. Rulers often had court astrologers to advise on when to go to war or negotiate peace. It's easy to scoff now, but imagine living in a world where you had no real control, no understanding of bacteria, no concept of physics, no reason why lightning might strike one house and not another. Superstition filled the gap left by ignorance, and magic became a coping mechanism. There were also protective charms and sacred objects everywhere. People carried amulets, wore crosses, or nailed iron horseshoes over their doors. Pilgrims collected holy relics, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, or vials of holy water, and believed they had miraculous powers. Churches advertised these relics, sometimes even faking them to draw pilgrims and their money. But not all magic was folk-based or benign. There was also ceremonial magic, practiced in secret by those with access to ancient texts. This was a darker, more scholarly pursuit, often drawing on Greek, Roman, and Arabic sources. Think grimoires, astrological calculations, and the summoning of spirits. It wasn't for the faint-hearted and was considered heretical by the Church. Still, it was whispered about among intellectuals and nobles alike. And what about fairies, elves, goblins, and spirits? People believed in an invisible world that coexisted with their own. Forests, wells, crossroads, and caves were seen as places of power. Portals where the boundaries between realms thinned. Travelers might leave offerings to appease these spirits or avoid certain places entirely. It's important to remember that belief in magic and superstition wasn't about stupidity. It was about survival in a world with no safety net. If a charm gave you peace or a ritual helped you sleep at night, that was valuable. If an old woman's herb poultice healed your child's cough, you didn't care if it was scientific. In fact, even the church had its own magical language: prayers, exorcisms, rituals, sacred incantations. The difference between what was holy and what was witchcraft often came down to who was doing it and whether they had power. Today, we have Google, antibiotics, and scientific journals. But back then, you had hope, habit, and whatever scraps of wisdom were passed down. Magic wasn't fantasy. It was comfort, control, and meaning in a world that rarely offered any. If you've ever watched a medieval movie and seen someone chained up in a dungeon, tormented by some hooded figure with a rusty set of tools, well, you're not entirely off. But real medieval justice was both more bureaucratic and more brutal than most people imagine. Let's begin with how the legal system worked. Contrary to the myth of total lawlessness, medieval Europe had a complex system of laws, courts, and punishments. The problem was that this system varied wildly by region, class, and era. There was no single medieval justice system. In England, for instance, you had common law courts. In France, you might face feudal justice under your local lord. In the Holy Roman Empire, imperial law, city law, and customary law could all exist side by side and contradict each other. For the average peasant, justice was local. If someone stole your cow, you didn't file a police report. You went to the manorial court, presided over by your lord or his representative. If the dispute was serious, murder, arson, or blasphemy, it might be escalated to a royal or ecclesiastical court. Now here's the catch. The system was deeply unequal. The higher your rank, the better your chances. Nobles were rarely executed unless they seriously upset the king. Clergy had a loophole called benefit of clergy, which allowed them to be tried in church courts, where punishments were lighter and torture was frowned upon. All you had to do to qualify was demonstrate literacy, usually by reading a passage from the Bible. If you could fake it, congratulations, you were a cleric for the day. For everyone else, justice could be swift and savage. Let's talk about torture, a favorite topic for dramatists. Yes, it existed, but it wasn't used for punishment. It was used to extract confessions, especially in cases like heresy, treason, or witchcraft. And once you confessed, truthfully or not, you were done, sentenced, often executed. Some of the more infamous torture methods included the rack, where your limbs were pulled until your joints dislocated, the thumb screw. Self-explanatory and incredibly painful. The strappado, where the accused was hoisted by the arms, then dropped suddenly, wrenching the shoulders. The Iron Maiden, famously associated with the era, but likely a later myth or exaggeration. The Pear of Anguish, allegedly inserted into the mouth or other orifices and expanded. There's debate over whether this was ever really used. However, despite Hollywood's love of iron and fire, torture wasn't as common as it's portrayed. It was expensive, required oversight, and needed official permission. That said, in times of panic, plague, rebellion, or witch scares, it could become widespread. If you were found guilty, your punishment depended on the crime and your social status. Here are a few common punishments. Fines, the most common penalty, often used to settle petty thefts, disputes, or damage to property. Stocks and pillories, public humiliation. You'd be locked in place while townsfolk jeered, threw rotten food, or worse. Branding, marking a criminal like a thief with a hot iron, a lifelong scar of shame. Whipping or flogging, especially for vagrants, adulterers, or those deemed morally corrupt. Amputation, thieves could lose hands or fingers. Particularly in harsh feudal systems, hanging, the go-to method for common criminals. Burning at the stake, reserved for heretics and witches. Boiling, beheading, or drawing and quartering, reserved for treason and especially heinous crimes. These were public spectacles meant to terrify and control. And then there were dungeons. Real medieval prisons were not like our modern penitentiaries. They weren't meant for long-term confinement. Instead, they were holding cells, places to store people while awaiting trial, ransom, or execution. Conditions were horrific. Dungeons were often in castle basements or towers, dark, damp, full of rats with little food or water. You could rot there for years if you had no advocate or coin to grease the wheels of justice. A famous example is the Tower of London, used to imprison nobles, political enemies, and even royalty. Some, like Anne Boleyn, met their end on its execution ground. Others lingered in cells, slowly forgotten. Interestingly, trial by combat and ordeals were also part of the judicial landscape, especially before the 13th century. If you were accused and maintained your innocence, you might have to prove it through divine intervention. For example, trial by hot iron. You'd carry a burning iron bar. If your wounds healed cleanly within a few days, God had judged you innocent. Trial by water. You'd be bound and thrown into a river. Sink? Innocent. Float? Guilty, because the water had rejected you. Trial by combat. Two parties fought, and the winner was declared right. Sometimes champions could fight on your behalf. There were even cases of old women hiring knights to duel for them. Eventually, the church condemned ordeals as superstition, and they faded out in most regions. But the symbolism of divine justice never really went away. Justice in the medieval world wasn't about fairness, it was about order. Crime was seen as a rupture in the divine and social fabric. Punishment wasn't just retribution, it was ritual, warning, and control. And because the system was deeply hierarchical, the poor bore the brunt. Today, we have due process, appeals, and laws designed to protect the accused. Back then, the law was a hammer, and most people were the anvil.
If you've ever complained about parking tickets or speed cameras, you might want to thank your lucky stars you weren't born in the Middle Ages. Because back then, law enforcement wasn't about protecting your rights. It was more about making examples out of people. Medieval law was less about justice and more about deterrence. Take theft, for example. Today, you might get a fine or some jail time. In the Middle Ages, you might lose a hand, literally. Petty crimes were often met with brutal punishments. Stocks in the town square, flogging,
branding, or being carted off to a dungeon weren't reserved for major criminals. These were just Tuesday.
And the worst part? The definition of guilt was often flexible. Did your neighbor accuse you of stealing a chicken? Time for trial by ordeal. Maybe you'd be forced to plunge your hand into boiling water. If it blistered, and of course it would, you were guilty. If you somehow didn't get horrifically burned, maybe God was on your side. Local lords often acted as judge, jury, and executioner. If they were in a bad mood, or if you'd gotten on their bad side, your odds of a fair hearing were slim to none, and police forces as we know them didn't exist. Instead, tithings, groups of 10 men, were responsible for keeping each other in check. If one of them committed a crime, the rest were expected to bring him to justice. If they didn't, they were all punished. Imagine your entire friend group getting punished because one of you couldn't keep it together after 3 meads and a missing loaf of bread. And let's not forget about debtors. In the modern world, you might get harassed by collections or see your credit score tank. But in medieval times, debt could land you in jail, and you'd stay there until you paid it off, which is tricky considering you can't earn money in jail. It was a trap, one that often ended in death. Modern comparison commentary. Today we've got Miranda rights, due process, and appeals courts. But in the Middle Ages, justice was more like roulette. Spin the wheel and hope it lands in your favor. Our contemporary system, while flawed, is rooted in fairness and the idea that everyone deserves a defense. That notion was completely foreign to the medieval mind. Forget epic battle scenes from movies. Medieval warfare wasn't glamorous, strategic, or even particularly quick. It was loud, chaotic, and often just downright horrifying. First off, armor wasn't lightweight. If you were lucky enough to be a knight, and I mean really lucky, like noble birth and years of expensive training lucky, you'd be suited up in steel plates that could weigh anywhere from 45 to 70 pounds. Imagine running a marathon in a suit of kitchen cabinets and you're halfway there. And if you weren't a knight, then congratulations. You're likely a peasant levied into service, armed with a sharpened stick, maybe a pitchfork, and some vague directions about which direction to charge. Most levied soldiers had little to no training. They were essentially human padding meant to absorb arrows while the real fighters clashed. Speaking of arrows, the English longbow was no joke. A skilled archer could fire 6 arrows a minute that could pierce plate armor from 200 yards. These weren't gentle pokes. They could tear through flesh, break bones, and leave you bleeding out in the mud. And since most medieval battlefields lacked any real medical aid, that's exactly where you'd die, face down in a swamp, wondering what hit you. And sieges? Oh, sieges were slow, dirty, demoralizing affairs. Imagine being holed up in a castle while the enemy flings dead animals and diseased corpses over the walls. They'd poison your wells, cut off your food supply, and just wait. Weeks or months would pass. Hunger would set in. Morale would break. People might start eating rats, or worse. Speaking of arrows, the English longbow was no joke. A skilled archer could fire 6 arrows a minute that could pierce plate armor from 200 yards. These weren't gentle pokes. They could tear through flesh, break bones, and leave you bleeding out in the mud. And since most medieval battlefields lacked any real medical aid, that's exactly where you'd die. Face down in a swamp, wondering what hit you. And sieges? Oh, sieges were slow, dirty, demoralizing affairs. Imagine being holed up in a castle while the enemy flings dead animals and diseased corpses over the walls. They'd poison your wells, cut off your food supply, and just wait. Weeks or months would pass. Hunger would set in. Morale would break. People might start eating rats, or worse. Then there were the weapons. War hammers, flails, morning stars. These were not elegant. These were heavy, blunt, and designed to maim. If you think a sword fight looks like something from The Witcher, think again. Real medieval combat was mostly about bashing your enemy until he stopped moving. No choreographed footwork, just brute force, screaming, and panic. And once the battle was over, no Geneva Conventions. Prisoners might be ransomed or massacred. Looting was common. I'm sorry I can't assist with that request.
Modern comparison commentary. We romanticize war sometimes, especially in video games or period dramas. But modern warfare, as terrifying and devastating as it is, at least comes with basic concepts like medical evacuation, military justice, and rules of engagement. In the medieval era, there were no medics, no human rights, only survival, and usually you didn't. So, if you ever find yourself wishing you could live as a noble knight riding into battle, remember, you'd probably last about 90 seconds before you were crushed under a horse, bludgeoned by a mace, or trampled by your own side in retreat.
If you've ever felt hesitant about going to the doctor today, maybe you're nervous about needles or annoyed by waiting rooms, take comfort in this. At least no one is suggesting leeches, chanting prayers over you, or drilling holes into your skull to let the demons out. Welcome to medieval medicine, a realm where guesswork, superstition, and horrifying procedures were the norm. Let's start with the basics. In medieval Europe, medicine wasn't grounded in science. It was rooted in humorism, the belief that the human body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, doctors believed your humors were imbalanced. The solution? Drain the excess. Bloodletting became the go-to cure for everything from a fever to a stubbed toe. And if a leech wasn't handy, they'd cut you with a knife and collect the blood in a bowl. Fun times. Surgery? Well, anesthesia wouldn't be invented for centuries. The closest you get was being drunk or biting down on a stick. Imagine having an arrowhead removed or a limb amputated in someone's barn with no antiseptic, no pain relief, and every reason to believe you were going to die from the surgery, not the injury. Doctors were more philosophers than practitioners. Many were educated in monasteries, reading texts written by Galen or Hippocrates centuries earlier. New discoveries weren't always welcomed. Dissection of human bodies was generally frowned upon, if not outright forbidden, so medical knowledge stagnated. Most treatments came from herbal remedies, incantations, or instructions in religious texts. And for the poor, you didn't see a doctor at all. You prayed or visited the local wise woman who might rub herbs on your chest and hope for the best. Then there were the plagues. The Black Death hit Europe in the mid-1300s and wiped out an estimated 1/3 to half of the population. People didn't understand germs or bacteria. They blamed bad air, divine punishment, or even certain ethnic groups, leading to horrific pogroms and superstition-fueled violence. Treatments ranged from sweet-smelling herbs to wearing charms to literal self-flagellation, as if whipping yourself would stop a bacterial infection. And after the disease passed, the trauma lingered. Quack doctors sprang up everywhere, offering miracle cures, while others sold talismans or mystical powders. Medicine became a blend of folklore, magic, and desperation. There was no real standard of care, no regulation, and no reliable cure for anything. Modern comparison commentary. It's easy to complain about modern healthcare. Costs, bureaucracy, long waits. But the fact that we understand germ theory, practice sterile surgery, and can recover from things like appendicitis or pneumonia, that's a miracle compared to medieval standards. Even minor infections in the Middle Ages could be death sentences. Imagine dying because your tooth got infected. That was reality, and if you did recover from an illness, it wasn't necessarily thanks to medicine. Most people healed despite the treatments they received. So next time you're annoyed about taking antibiotics or sitting in a clinic, just picture someone sawing off your leg with a rusty blade and telling you it's God's will. You know that fresh, clean feeling after a hot shower? The simple luxury of indoor plumbing? Yeah, medieval folks didn't know anything about that. In fact, sanitation in the Middle Ages was more of a suggestion than a standard. If you've ever walked past a public dumpster on a hot summer day, you might have caught a whiff of what life smelled like on your average medieval street. Let's start with the basics. Human waste. The problem wasn't just that there were no flushing toilets. It's that the concept of a sewer system barely existed in most places. In towns and cities, chamber pots were the norm. These were essentially glorified buckets. After doing your business, you might empty it in the designated spot, or just toss it out the window with a cheerful "Gardez l'eau," a French phrase meaning "watch out for the water." Hope your neighbors were quick on their feet. And then there were cesspits, underground holes where waste collected. They weren't regularly cleaned, and when they overflowed, the contents seeped into streets, walls, and even water sources. If you think that sounds like a recipe for disease, you're absolutely right. Running water? Rare. Most people got their drinking water from wells or rivers, many of which were downstream from places where people washed clothes, bathed, or dumped waste. Contaminated water led to deadly outbreaks of cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. But without knowledge of bacteria, people had no clue their water was the culprit. Public bathhouses did exist in some places, especially during the early medieval period and in Islamic territories where hygiene was culturally and religiously emphasized. But by the later Middle Ages in Europe, fear of disease led to a decline in communal bathing. People genuinely thought that water opened the pores and let in sickness. So instead of bathing, they layered on perfumes and hoped for the best. It gets worse. Animals roamed the streets freely. Dogs, pigs, chickens, and rats lived among the people, leaving behind droppings and spreading fleas and disease. In fact, rats and their fleas played a central role in spreading the Black Death. But to medieval citizens, these were just part of everyday life, no different from the mud, the smoke, or the occasional decomposing body. In castles and manors, things were marginally better. Emphasis on marginally. Privies, primitive toilets, were sometimes built into the walls with chutes that led to the moat or a pit. But even royalty and nobility weren't immune to bad smells and worse hygiene. Court records mention entire palace wings being rendered unusable due to the buildup of filth. Modern comparison commentary. Today, we have sewage systems that whisk away waste without us ever thinking about it. We have trash collection, water treatment plants, pest control, and public health agencies. Even the dirtiest city block now would seem like a paradise compared to a medieval street. It's no exaggeration to say that modern sanitation is one of the greatest contributors to increased human lifespan. In the Middle Ages, the lack of basic hygiene wasn't just unpleasant, it was deadly. Diseases spread rapidly, and people often died without ever understanding why. Today, we complain about potholes or graffiti. Back then, people worried about stepping in actual rivers of human excrement. And let's not forget the psychological toll. Imagine living your whole life surrounded by grime, foul odors, and constant illness, without ever realizing it didn't have to be that way. Cleanliness wasn't just unattainable, it was barely imaginable. Let's talk about what it was like to be a woman in the Middle Ages. Spoiler alert, it wasn't exactly a time of empowerment and liberation. For most medieval women, life was confined to a small orbit: home, hearth, and hard labor. Whether you were a peasant or a noble, being born female meant you were automatically second class. Your future was pretty much decided the moment you drew breath. You'd be married off, often young, bear children, as many as your body could handle, and spend your days serving your husband, your children, and your community, in that order. For peasant women, the daily grind was just that, a grind. Up at dawn, they cooked meals over open fires, baked bread, hauled water, tended gardens, raised livestock, spun wool, mended clothes, and if they were lucky, got 5 minutes to breathe before doing it all again the next day. And that was on a good day. Add in childbirth, illness, or crop failures, and life became not just difficult, but dangerous. Worse still, medieval childbirth was one of the riskiest things a woman could go through. With no modern medicine, zero understanding of infection, and no pain relief beyond strong hands and silent prayers, even a normal labor could end in death. Many women died young, often before the age of 30, from complications of childbirth or infections afterward. Now, if you were a noble woman, you might think things were better. In some ways, yes. You didn't have to scrub floors or work the fields, but you did have to play your role as a political pawn. Marriages were arranged for strategic gain, often before girls even reached puberty. Your body wasn't really yours. It was part of the alliance package. You'd be expected to produce heirs, maintain the household, and always obey your husband. Education for women was limited at best. Noble girls might learn to read and write, especially if destined for a convent. But most girls were taught only what they needed to run a household. Forget philosophy, law, or science. That was man's work. A curious, intelligent woman could be seen as dangerous, or even accused of witchcraft. And speaking of witches, let's not gloss over the fact that being an outspoken, unmarried, or simply odd woman could make you a target for persecution. Superstition was rampant. Women were often blamed for illness, bad harvests, or just bad luck. If something went wrong in your village, and you were a midwife with a sharp tongue, or a widow who kept to herself, you might find yourself at the business end of a torch-wielding mob. Religion didn't help either. The church taught that women were morally weaker, more easily tempted, and responsible for original sin. That whole Eve ate the apple thing, yeah, it did a number on how women were perceived. Obedience, humility, and silence were virtues constantly hammered into them. And yet women did find ways to assert power. Some managed estates in their husband's absence. Others ran successful businesses. In nunneries, educated women became powerful abbesses with real influence. In rare cases, like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Hildegard of Bingen, women rose to prominence, but they were the exceptions, not the rule. Modern commentary. If you've ever felt frustrated by gender inequality today, imagine being born in a world where you couldn't own property, file a legal claim, vote, learn algebra, or even choose who you married. Where your worth was measured by your obedience, your dowry, and how many sons you could bear. It's hard to overstate how confined and restricted women's lives were. Their labor was constant but invisible. Their pain was expected but ignored. And their ambitions, if they had any, were usually dismissed as foolish or sinful. It gives real perspective to the progress made over the last few centuries. The ability to vote, get an education, control reproductive choices, pursue a career, or live independently. These are not small things. They're monumental leaps from the harsh limitations women lived under in the Middle Ages. If you lived in medieval Europe, you didn't just go to church. You lived through the church. Its influence was as constant as the sun rising, or at least as constant as the tolling of church bells that marked nearly every hour of your day. The medieval church wasn't just a Sunday ritual, it was the center of community life, the ultimate authority in education, morality, healthcare, and even politics. It owned vast swaths of land, collected taxes in the form of tithes, 1/10 of your income or harvest, and wielded spiritual power like a sword and scepter rolled into one. Even the calendar bent to its will. Nearly every event, from planting to harvest to marriage and even rest days, revolved around the church's liturgical calendar. Feast days, saints' days, fasting seasons, and holy festivals dictated when you could eat meat, when you worked the fields, and when you were expected to show up at Mass. And there was no such thing as being spiritual but not religious. You were baptized into the church as an infant, married under its rites, and buried with its blessings. If you dared to step outside its teachings, you risked social exile, or worse, charges of heresy. And heresy could mean execution. The church held the keys to your eternal soul, literally. The idea of heaven and hell wasn't abstract, it was real, vivid, and terrifying. And the church positioned itself as the sole gatekeeper to salvation. Want to confess your sins? Pay a priest. Want to reduce time in purgatory? Buy an indulgence. Want your dead relatives to get into heaven? Pray hard and donate. For many, this wasn't exploitation. It was comfort. The church offered structure in a chaotic world. It taught that suffering had meaning, that good behavior would be rewarded, and that justice, if not served here, would be handled in the afterlife. But let's not kid ourselves. The church also abused this power. Priests were supposed to live humbly, but many lived lavishly. Corruption was rampant. Some monks drank and gambled. Bishops wielded armies. The papacy itself became tangled in politics, with more than one pope acting more like a warlord than a shepherd. And for the average peasant, the church's demands could be suffocating. On top of working long hours and paying taxes to the local lord, you also had to hand over a chunk of your earnings to the church, under threat of spiritual damnation. Miss Mass, commit adultery, doubt a doctrine, you could be punished with public shaming, excommunication, or, in some cases, death. Even literacy was filtered through the church. Most people couldn't read, and those who could often learned only Latin, the language of the church. So the Bible, you couldn't read it yourself. You had to rely on a priest to interpret it for you. And the way he interpreted it could very much depend on what message the church wanted to send. Modern commentary. Imagine if your local church was also your school, your bank, your court, and your government. Imagine if every decision you made, what to eat, who to marry, how to dress, how to die, had to be filtered through a religious lens. That was life in the Middle Ages. Today we take for granted the idea of secular government, of religious freedom, of being able to not believe in anything if we so choose. But for medieval people, even the idea of questioning the church's authority was radical, dangerous even. There's a reason the Reformation in the 1500s shook Europe to its core. It wasn't just a theological debate. It was the first crack in an institution that had dominated life for 1,000 years. Before that, the church wasn't just part of life, it was life. If life in medieval times was already tough, the arrival of the Black Death in the mid-14th century was like a hammer blow that shattered everything. Imagine a disease so terrifying, so fast-acting, and so deadly that it wiped out nearly half the population of Europe in just a few years. That was the reality of the plague, a pandemic that would haunt history as one of the darkest chapters ever. The Black Death,
likely arrived via trade routes, hitching a ride on fleas that infested rats aboard ships coming into Europe from Asia. What made it so terrifying was its suddenness and mystery. People didn't know what caused it, how it spread, or how to stop it. It felt like an invisible, unstoppable force of death.
Symptoms were gruesome. Painful swellings called buboes appeared in the groin, armpits, and neck. Victims suffered fever, chills, vomiting, and delirium. Death could come within days. The disease was indiscriminate. Nobles and peasants alike fell victim, as did kings, queens, and clergy. Society crumbled in the face of such devastation. Entire villages were abandoned. Farms went untended, leading to food shortages. Trade slowed to a halt. Towns emptied as survivors fled or died. The usual social order broke down. One terrifying consequence was the rise of scapegoating. With no medical knowledge, people sought someone to blame. Jews were often accused of poisoning wells or cursing the land, leading to horrific massacres and expulsions. Fear and superstition fueled violent outbursts that tore communities apart. At the same time, the church's authority took a huge hit. Priests and monks were not immune to the plague, and many fled their posts, abandoning their flocks. The church had promised salvation and protection, but millions died anyway. People began to question long-held beliefs and look for new answers. Economically, the plague had a paradoxical effect. With so many people dead, labor became scarce, and surviving workers could demand higher wages or better conditions. This shift started to undermine the rigid feudal system that had bound peasants to the land and their lords for centuries. But the trauma of the plague lingered for generations. It changed how people thought about life, death, and faith. Art and literature reflected this new obsession with mortality. The dance of death motif, for example, reminded everyone that death comes for all, regardless of status. It's hard to overstate just how earth-shattering the Black Death was. Imagine losing nearly half your community in a blink of history's eye. The psychological scars would be immense. Trust in institutions collapsed. Fear ruled everyday life, and the sheer scale of death was unimaginable. For us today, living through pandemics like COVID-19, some echoes of that fear remain. But medieval people had no science, no vaccines, no real understanding of germs. Their world was plunged into chaos, not just medical, but social, economic, and spiritual. The plague cracked open medieval society and set in motion the slow unraveling of the old order. It paved the way for modernity, but at a horrific cost. If you think your daily worries are bad, imagine living in a time when death could come knocking anytime, and you had no idea how to stop it. When it came to healing in medieval times, you had better luck crossing your fingers than trusting a doctor. Medicine was a wild mix of superstition, guesswork, and ancient beliefs handed down from the Greeks and Romans, often misunderstood and misapplied. There were no antibiotics, no anesthesia, and no germ theory. Instead, medieval medicine was more about rituals and humors than real cures. The dominant medical theory was the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and the idea was to keep these in balance. If you felt sick, it was because your humors were out of whack. The cure often involved bloodletting, purging, or administering bizarre concoctions made from herbs, animal parts, and sometimes downright disgusting ingredients. Barbers were among the closest things to doctors, performing bloodletting with razors and leeches or pulling teeth. Surgery was a last resort and usually done without anesthesia, meaning the patient had to endure the pain or be held down by friends. Instruments were crude, and infections were common and often fatal.
Monasteries played a big role in healthcare, as monks copied ancient medical texts and prepared herbal remedies. But even their knowledge was limited. Spells, prayers, and charms were just as important as herbs. Illness was often seen as a punishment from God or caused by evil spirits, so spiritual healing was as critical as physical treatment. One of the most infamous medieval cures was the use of urine, believed to have healing powers, or the application of animal dung and blood. It's easy to scoff now, but without modern science, people grasped at anything that might help.
Despite the limitations, medieval physicians laid groundwork for future medical advances. Universities began teaching medicine more systematically, preserving ancient knowledge and slowly building a tradition of observation and theory. Modern commentary. It's tempting to dismiss medieval medicine as pure nonsense, but remember, people did the best they could with the knowledge they had. Bloodletting and leeches sound barbaric now, but the idea of balancing bodily fluids was a rational framework back then. What really stands out is how intertwined medicine was with religion and superstition. It wasn't just about curing the body. Illness was a cosmic and spiritual event. That's something modern medicine has largely separated from, for better or worse. The gruesome and sometimes dangerous treatments also remind us how precious modern healthcare is. A simple antibiotic or safe surgery today can save lives instantly, things medieval people couldn't even imagine. So while you're grateful for modern hospitals, remember, those medieval healers paved the road, however bumpy, toward the medical science we rely on today. If you think medieval food was all about stale bread and watery soup, you're not entirely wrong. But there's more to the story. What people ate depended heavily on their social class, geography, and the season. Peasants and nobles might share some staples, but the quality, variety, and quantity were worlds apart. For the peasants, their diet was mostly simple and repetitive. Bread, porridge made from barley or oats, vegetables like onions, cabbage, and beans, and occasionally some cheese or eggs. Meat was a rare luxury for the lower classes. Hunting was usually forbidden for peasants, and the animals they kept were primarily for labor or milk. Fish, especially freshwater varieties, was more common because of religious fasting rules that required abstaining from meat on many days. Meals were cooked over open hearths, so smoky and salty flavors dominated. Spices were expensive and mostly used by the wealthy, so peasant food was often bland by modern standards. Preservation was a challenge. Without refrigeration, meat was salted or smoked, and vegetables were dried or pickled. Nobles and royalty, however, enjoyed feasts that dazzled with multiple courses, exotic spices imported from the East like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, and elaborate meat dishes featuring venison, boar, and game birds. Spices were not just for flavor. They were a status symbol, flaunting wealth and access to trade routes. Sweets like honey cakes and fruit preserves were common in noble households too. The church also influenced medieval eating habits. Lent and other fasting periods required avoiding meat, leading to creative vegetarian dishes and a heavy reliance on fish. Monks, especially, developed diverse recipes and cultivated herbs and vegetables in monastery gardens. Nutrition-wise, the medieval diet was often deficient in vitamins and minerals, particularly among peasants. Rickets and scurvy were not uncommon. The heavy reliance on grains could cause digestive issues, and foodborne illnesses were rampant due to poor hygiene and storage. Modern commentary, thinking about medieval food, makes you appreciate today's supermarkets and fast food chains, even if they're not the healthiest options. The medieval diet was incredibly seasonal and local, a necessity, but also limiting. Imagine months without fresh vegetables or fruit. The social divide in food is fascinating too. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was a signifier of class and power.
The more spices on your plate, the higher your status. Also, despite the scarcity and simplicity for peasants, there was a deep connection to the land and its cycles. Today's slow food movement and farm-to-table concepts echo some medieval realities, just with more variety and hygiene.
When you think medieval entertainment, your mind might jump straight to gruesome public executions,
Brutal torture devices, or even the occasional jousting tournament. But medieval people had a wide variety of ways to entertain themselves, some surprisingly joyful and inventive. For peasants, entertainment was often tied to the agricultural calendar and religious festivals. Seasonal fairs, village dances, and communal feasts brought people together. Music played a huge role. Fiddlers, pipers, and drummers would fill the air with folk tunes. Storytelling was a cherished pastime, with traveling minstrels sharing epic tales and ballads that preserved history and legends. Games like Nine Men's Morris and hoop rolling were popular among children and adults alike. Board games and dice were common too, though gambling was sometimes frowned upon by the church.
The nobility, meanwhile,
Enjoyed more elaborate entertainment. Jousting tournaments weren't just sport. They were political and social events, filled with pageantry. Noble courts had jesters, musicians, and poets to amuse the lords and ladies. Poetry competitions and singing contests showcased skill and wit. The theater, though rudimentary, began developing, often tied to religious celebrations with morality plays that taught Christian lessons. These plays were performed in town squares or churchyards, accessible to all social classes. Interestingly, despite their reputation for brutality, medieval people also valued humor and satire. Many manuscripts contain witty marginal drawings, poking fun at clergy and nobility alike. The idea that medieval life was only grim and harsh overlooks the rich cultural life they enjoyed.
modern commentary. It's easy to think of the Middle Ages as just
Dark and grim, but when you zoom in, you find lively communities filled with music, stories, and games.
the way people used entertainment to build social bonds and pass on culture
Is something we still do today.
even if our forms have changed.
Also, the importance of public festivals and fairs as moments of release and joy stands out. It's a reminder that humans have always needed ways to step away from daily toil and connect with others through fun. The theatrical roots from this period eventually blossomed into Renaissance drama and eventually modern theater. So next time you enjoy a play, you can thank the medieval peasants and monks who kept those early traditions alive.
When you think of medieval medicine,
Your mind probably conjures up images of leeches, strange potions, and prayers to saints. And you're not wrong. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a mix of ancient knowledge, superstition, religious belief, and surprisingly practical herbal remedies. Medical knowledge was largely based on the teachings of Hippocrates and Galen, ancient Greek physicians whose ideas dominated Western medicine for over a millennium. They believed in the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that health depended on their balance. If you were sick, it was often because one humor was out of whack. Treatments could include bloodletting, often with leeches, purging, herbal remedies, and prayer. Surgeons were generally seen as lower status than physicians and often performed amputations or treated wounds without the sophisticated knowledge we expect today.
hospitals did exist, but they were more places of hospitality and prayer than medical treatment.
Monasteries often provided care, with monks and nuns using herbal gardens and spiritual healing. Disease was poorly understood, and plagues like the Black Death devastated populations because people had no idea how infections spread.
They tried all sorts of cures, from carrying lucky charms to flagellation, whipping oneself to atone for sins and hopefully ward off disease. Modern commentary. Medieval medicine looks primitive now, but it laid important groundwork for future advances. The reliance on spiritual healing shows how intertwined health and religion were. Health was not just physical, but spiritual. It's fascinating how some herbal remedies used then are still studied today for their pharmacological properties. The focus on balancing the body's systems parallels modern holistic approaches, even if the humorous theory was wrong. And while their understanding of contagion was non-existent, some hygiene practices, like quarantine during plagues, show medieval doctors did observe patterns in disease spread, even if they couldn't explain them. It's a humbling reminder of how far medical science has come and how much we owe to early healers who combined observation, faith, and trial and error in a difficult world. So, after all that dust and gloom and all those plagues and power struggles, why does the Middle Ages still matter? Why do we keep studying a time when life was often harsh, brutal, and boring by modern standards? The answer is, the medieval period laid the foundations for so much of what defines the modern world. Law, government, architecture, education, literature, and even the idea of what a society could be. Medieval innovations include the development of universities, like the University of Bologna and Oxford, the spread of Gothic architecture with soaring cathedrals, the codification of legal systems, think Magna Carta, and the birth of parliamentary democracy in embryonic forms. The Middle Ages also gave us literary classics like Dante's Divine Comedy, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and the Arthurian legends that still inspire movies, books, and games today. In terms of culture and identity, the medieval period shaped modern Europe's languages, borders, and religious institutions, all still influential worldwide. Personal reflection. Despite its hardships, the Middle Ages show us resilience, creativity, and the human drive to organize and improve society. Understanding this era helps us appreciate how progress often happens slowly, with fits and starts. It also humbles us, reminding us how much daily life has changed and how many people in the past face struggles we can barely imagine. So next time you stroll past an ancient castle, visit a cathedral, or read a medieval story, remember, you're walking through echoes of a time that still shapes our world.